The Thursday shift at Carmine's was supposed to end at 11. It was quarter past midnight when Susane Coldson finally hauled the last tray of glasses into the dishwashing bay and peeled off her apron. Her feet were past the point of hurting. They had gone quiet in a particular way she'd come to recognize over 3 years of waitressing, not numbness, exactly more like resignation. The body accepting what it could not change. She filled a plastic cup with water from the kitchen tap and drank it standing up, staring at the industrial fan mounted near the ceiling that rattled faintly every time it completed a revolution. Outside, she could hear the last table on the floor, a group of four who had ordered a second bottle of wine at 10:30, which was exactly the kind of decision that made her job extend by 2 hours. Marcus, the floor manager, leaned through the kitchen door. "One more, Suzanne. Sorry, just one. They already have the check. New table, just sat down, bar area, 2 people." She looked at him. "I'll comp your parking," he said. She didn't own a car. She walked to campus, but she put the apron back on. The bar area of Carmine's existed in a different register than the main dining room, lower, lighting, smaller tables arranged without any particular logic, a kind of ambient murmur that made conversations feel more private than they were. It was the place people came on first dates they weren't sure about or when they needed a drink and didn't want to explain why. The man was sitting with his back to the wall. Suzanne registered him the way she registered everyone quickly, categorically, with the efficiency born of having to assess tables in under 3 seconds. Late 40s, she guessed. Dark suit jacket worn over an open-collar shirt, no tie. The kind of casual that cost money to achieve. Good posture. A glass of water in front of him and nothing else, which was unusual for this hour. The woman across from him was not eating. She was leaning forward with both elbows on the table, one hand propped under her chin, and she was talking in the low, deliberate way of someone who had rehearsed what she was saying. She was wearing a dress that had required a decision, and her hair fell across one shoulder at an angle that looked less accidental than it appeared. She was beautiful, and she knew it, and she was using it. Suzanne picked up the cocktail menu from behind the bar and crossed to the table. She caught fragments as she approached. The woman's voice, slightly too loud for the space, "You could have called, but you didn't, which tells me something." And then she shifted to something lower, something Suzanne couldn't parse, and the man nodded once with the expression of someone being professionally patient. "Good evening," Suzanne said. "Can I get you started with something?" The woman barely glanced at her. The man looked up. "Water's fine for me," he said. His voice was even neither warm nor cold. "Whatever she'd like." "Champagne," the woman said without looking at the menu. "Whatever's good." Suzanne kept her face neutral. "We have a Veuve Clicquot by the glass. Billionaire Salmon if you prefer something drier." "Veuve," the woman said, like she was confirming something she'd already decided. Suzanne nodded and went back to the bar. She could see them from where she stood while the bartender poured. The woman was talking again. The man was listening. He held his water glass without drinking it, turning it slightly against the table surface. Not nervously, Suzanne thought, but like someone who needed something to do with their hands while being very careful not to engage too directly with what was being said. She carried the champagne back to the table. "And I thought maybe we just needed to see each other again," the woman was saying. "In person. Sometimes things look different in person." The man's expression didn't change. "They often do," he said. There was a small silence. "Is that a yes?" the woman asked. "It's an observation," he said. Suzanne set down the champagne flute. She asked if they wanted to hear the late-night menu. The woman said no. The man said thank you. She walked back to the bar, and for the next 12 minutes she was busy enough that she didn't watch them. She refilled the wine on the foretop, ran a check for the couple who had been there since 8, cleared 2 tables. But when she came back past the bar area to put away the receipt book, the dynamic had shifted. The woman's posture had changed. She was sitting straighter now, the casual lean abandoned, and there was something brittle in her face that hadn't been there before. She said something Suzanne couldn't hear. The man responded briefly. She said it again louder. Not loud enough to carry to the tables nearby, but loud enough that Suzanne caught the edge of it. Because you could have anyone, and that's the problem. The man set down his water glass. "I appreciate you coming," he said. "Clearly. Not unkindly, but clearly. I do. But I think we've been through this." The woman held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her champagne, finished it in a way that was meant to look composed and did not quite succeed, and stood up. She adjusted her dress. She said something short that Suzanne couldn't catch. The man said nothing. The woman walked past the bar without looking at either of them and disappeared through the front door. The man stayed at the table. Susane came over to clear the champagne flute. "Can I get you anything else?" He looked at the door, then back at her. Not distressed, she thought, just tired in the specific way of someone who has had the same conversation more than once. "Just the check," he said. She went to close it out. In the kitchen, Marcus was eating crackers from a box and watching something on his phone with the sound off. "They order anything?" he asked. "One champagne." "That's it. That's it." He made a face. "What are they, a date?" "Something like that," she said. She hadn't liked him, she decided. Not for any one reason she could articulate cleanly, but for the sum of it, the expensive casualness, the way the woman had clearly shown up hoping for something and left without it, the way he had stayed at the table alone and seemed from a distance almost relieved. There was something in that bothered her. Some men she'd noticed cultivated exactly that kind of effect. They didn't pursue. They simply existed in a way that made people come to them, and then they got to feel principled about the rejection. She brought him the check. He signed it without looking at the amount. She saw the tip before she pocketed the slip 40%, which was objectively generous and which somehow irritated her. He left. The four top left 10 minutes later. She swept the floor and locked up at 12:30. On the walk home, she thought about the mid-semester case analysis due Thursday, her shift Friday, and whether the second-hand winter coat she'd found at the Cambridge Salvation Army was going to hold up through February. She did not think about the man at the bar again. Admit. February in Cambridge had a particular quality. Not the postcard kind of New England winter, not the kind they put on calendars, but a compressed grayish low-light kind of cold that arrived in November and simply stayed. The brick buildings of Harvard Yard collected ice on their ledges, and the heating in Cabot House, where Susane had been living since sophomore year, ran either too hot or not at all, and the question of which one you got on a given night was not something you could predict. She liked it. She liked the dormitory's specific smell. Old wood institutional cleaner, the ghost of 1,000 previous occupants, and the way the library stayed open until 2 in the morning, and the reading rooms were full of people who actually cared what they were reading. She'd grown up in a town in western Massachusetts called Greenfield that was perfectly fine and perfectly small, and she'd spent most of her adolescence understanding that she wanted something different without being able to name what it was. Harvard had named it. Or more accurately, Harvard had given her a language for what she already wanted, which was harder than people made it sound. The scholarship covered tuition and housing. The waitressing covered everything else. Food books, the occasional bus ticket home for Thanksgiving. She'd worked out the math with a spreadsheet she updated every month, the kind of personal financial accounting that her wealthier classmates found either admirable or slightly depressing, depending on their level of self-awareness. She was not ashamed of it. That was the thing people sometimes expected her to be, and she wasn't. The internship posting had gone up on the business school's career portal on a Monday afternoon in early March, and she'd almost missed it because she was in the middle of case prep and wasn't checking her email. Her roommate Priya had forwarded it with a string of exclamation points, and the message, "This is the one." Priya was not wrong. Brown Tech Corporation Strategic Development Internship. Summer cycle. Brown Tech was the kind of company that appeared on the syllabus before it appeared in the news cycle, which was how Susane thought about corporate prestige. Not whether people talked about it at parties, but whether professors used it as an example. She had read 3 case studies on Brown Tech in the past 2 years alone. The company had been founded in 2001 with a focus on enterprise data infrastructure, which was unglamorous, in a way that had turned out to be extremely lucrative, and it had expanded over the past decade into logistics, software, supply chain management, and most recently, a division that did something with predictive analytics that the business school had written a case study on the previous fall. It was a Boston company, which was still slightly unusual for a firm at that scale. Most companies like it had moved to New York or San Francisco years ago, and it was privately held, which was rarer still. She applied the Tuesday after the posting went up. She rewrote the cover letter 4 times. She asked her organizational behavior professor to review it, which he did with a pencil, and left her 3 pages of annotated feedback. She revised. She submitted. She heard back in 6 days, interview scheduled Thursday, March 14th, 2 o'clock, Brown Tech offices, Seaport District. She told Priya. Priya took her out for moderately priced sushi to celebrate the interview, not the outcome, which was a distinction Priya was careful about. The interview itself is the thing, Priya said. The outcome is separate. Don't conflate them. I'm not conflating them. You have your outcome face on. I don't have an outcome face. You've been reviewing your portfolio at the table for 20 minutes. Susane put her tablet away. She took the Silver Line to Seaport on a Thursday afternoon in the kind of weather that couldn't decide whether it was raining or not, and settled on misting as a compromise. The Brown Tech building was on Congress Street, not ostentatiously large, a 15-story glass and steel building, with the company name in clean sans serif lettering above the entrance, the kind of architectural restraint that she'd come to understand was its own form of statement. She was wearing her good suit, which was charcoal gray, and had required 3 dry cleaning cycles to return to something presentable after she'd bought it secondhand the previous fall. She'd gotten her hair trimmed the week before. She arrived 11 minutes early, which was her preference early enough to compose herself not so early as to seem anxious. The lobby was open and well lit. There was a reception desk with 2 people behind it, a seating area with leather chairs arranged around a low table with industry publications on it, and a large abstract sculpture near the elevator bank that might have been made of reclaimed metal or might have been purchased from a gallery. She couldn't tell which, and she thought that ambiguity was probably intentional. She gave her name. She was given a visitor badge. She waited. A woman in her 30s named Dana, introduced as Julian Brown's executive assistant. A title, Susane registered and then stored, came to collect her at 2:05 and walked her to the 11th floor where a small conference room had been prepared with water and a notepad. The walls were glass on one side looking out over the office floor, and she could see people at their desks moving with the easy efficiency of people who mostly knew what they were doing. "Mr. Brown will be in shortly," Dana said. "Can I get you anything else?" "I'm fine, thank you." Dana left. Susane set her portfolio on the table and her hands in her lap and looked at the water and did not drink it. She reviewed the case studies she'd memorized. She thought about the operational expansion question she'd prepared. She thought about the supply chain analytics acquisition and what it meant for the company's Q3 positioning. She was ready. She was always ready. The door opened. She stood out of habit and turned, and her mind did the thing it always did when she encountered an unexpected variable. It took a fraction of a second to process and then recalibrated very fast and very cleanly. The man from the bar. He came in the way someone comes into a room they own, which was not arrogantly but simply, without any of the performative adjustments people make in unfamiliar spaces. He was in a different suit, charcoal, with a subtle texture, and without the late-hour tiredness she'd read on him at Carmine's. He was carrying nothing. He looked exactly like the photograph on the company website which she had looked at and evidently had not retained. He saw her. Something happened in his face. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition that was doing several things at once, and then it smoothed into the neutral professional expression of someone conducting a business meeting. "Miss Coldson," he said. "Mr. Brown," she said. He sat across from her. He opened his copy of her resume. "You graduated top of your cohort at Mount Holyoke," he said. "Why Harvard for graduate study?" She answered. Her voice came out even and she was grateful for it. He listened in the way she'd noticed at the bar completely, without interrupting, without any of the performative nodding that people used to signal attention while actually composing their next sentence. She understood very quickly that he was not going to mention Carmine's, and that this was a deliberate choice, and that whether it was courtesy or strategy she couldn't determine yet. They talked for 35 minutes. He asked about the Brown Tech Analytics case study she'd referenced in her cover letter, and she walked him through her analysis, and he pushed back on 2 of her conclusions, and she pushed back on his pushback, and he wrote something on his notepad. "The operational integration question," he said. "You suggested a phased rollout model rather than simultaneous deployment. What's your reasoning?" "Simultaneous deployment optimizes for speed and maximizes short-term efficiency data, but it's brittle. If one integration point fails, you lose visibility across all of them at once. Phased rollout is slower, but it gives you controlled failure points." He considered this. The board was persuaded by the simultaneous model. "I know. I read the press coverage." She paused. "With respect, I think the board was optimizing for announcement value." He looked at her. Then something happened in his expression that took her a moment to identify. Not irritation, not amusement exactly, but the thing between them. "That may be true," he said. He closed her resume. He asked if she had questions. She asked 3 about the specific project pipeline for the summer cycle, about the team structure for strategic development, and about how the department defined success for an intern. He answered all three with specificity, not with the glossy recruitment speak she'd encountered at other interviews. At the end, she stood. He extended his hand. "Thank you for coming in," he said. "Thank you for the opportunity," she said. His grip was brief and firm and entirely professional. He opened the door, and Dana appeared as if by arrangement to walk her back to the elevator. In the lobby, Susane handed back her visitor badge. She went through the revolving door and stood on Congress Street in the gray March air and let out a long, controlled breath. She had not expected that. She did not know yet what to do with it. She walked to the Silver Line stop. On the train back to Cambridge, she sat with her portfolio in her lap and watched the harbor past the windows. She thought about the interview itself, what he'd said, the pushback that had felt less like a challenge and more like an evaluation of whether she'd yield, and the fact that she had not yielded. She thought that had probably been right. She thought about the woman at the bar who had left without what she'd come for. She thought about the tip on the receipt. She put her earbuds in and listened to the rest of the ride. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening, when she'd just come off a 5-hour shift and her feet were in the resigned stage again, her phone buzzed with an email from Brown Tech's HR department. She read it standing in the Carmine's parking lot in her apron. Then she read it again. She called Priya. "I got it," she said. Priya made a sound that was less a word than an expression. "I knew it. I literally knew it. I didn't know it. You always say that. How many times have you said that and been wrong?" Susane thought about it. "Never. So why do you keep saying it?" "Because the one time I assume I have it will be the time I don't." "That is a psychologically interesting position," Priya said. "Also irrational. Also very you." A pause. "When do you start?" "June 2nd. "That's amazing, Susane." It was. She stood in the parking lot in the cold and let herself feel it for 30 seconds. The particular warmth of something actually happening, not just being planned. Then she went back inside to finish her closing side work. She spent the 4 days before her first day the way she spent most significant transitions, by over-preparing. She read everything she could find about Brown Tech's current strategic priorities. She reread the analytics acquisition case study and 2 others she hadn't used in the interview. She put together a list of questions she thought might come up in the first week and drafted answers to them. She bought a second professional blouse to supplement the one she had from a store in Cambridge that was cheap but not visibly cheap. She ironed both blouses the night before. She did not think very much about Julian Brown specifically. She thought about him a little, not about the bar. She'd processed that and filed it. She had misread a situation she'd caught only from one angle at midnight, and she'd formed an impression on incomplete information, and the impression had turned out to be wrong. She'd done this before, though less dramatically. She was aware it was a failure mode of hers, the quick read, the filed conclusion, the confidence that she'd gotten it right. She was smart enough to know that the confidence was sometimes earned and sometimes not, and not always able to distinguish between the two in the moment. The professional opinion she was reserving. She'd seen one interaction under duress and one interview. Neither was enough. She was going to go in and observe. That was the plan. The first morning of the internship, she arrived at the Brown Tech lobby at 8:45. There were 3 other interns, 2 from Wharton and 1 from MIT Sloan, and they gathered in a loose cluster near the reception desk with the slightly stiff awkwardness of people who didn't know yet whether they were going to get along. Dana collected them and took them to a conference room on the 8th floor where they received laptops, ID badges, a benefits package they wouldn't need, and an orientation packet. Julian Brown appeared at 9:15. He came in without ceremony and sat at the head of the table and said, "Welcome. I want to give you 10 minutes of context, and then I want to hear from each of you. What you know, what you think you don't know, and what you're here to figure out." In that order. He talked for 9 minutes and 40 seconds. She timed it not deliberately, but she noticed the time at the start and the time at the end. In 9 minutes and 40 seconds, he covered the company's current strategic priorities, the specific projects the interns would be involved with, and a description of the company culture that was the least performative version of that speech she had ever heard. He did not say, "We treat everyone like family." He did not use the word passionate. He said, "We work hard, and we expect precision, and we try to make decisions we can explain to ourselves afterward." Then he went around the table. The first Wharton intern talked for 4 minutes about his background in quantitative finance. Julian listened without interrupting. The second Wharton intern talked for 3 minutes about her experience in supply chain consulting. Julian asked her one question about the difference between consulting and in-house work, and she answered it well, and he wrote something. The MIT Sloan intern. A man named Raphael, who had clearly been building towards something since the orientation packet arrived, launched into a 5-minute explanation of a proprietary model he'd developed for supply chain risk assessment. Julian let him finish. Then he said very pleasantly, "What's one thing the model can't predict?" Raphael paused. "Could you clarify?" "Every model has failure conditions," Julian said. "What are yours?" There was a beat. "I'd need to think about that." "That's fine," Julian said. "Think about it and we can talk tomorrow." He moved on without any editorial commentary. When he got to Susane, she said, "I have strong quantitative skills and I read fast. I'm here to learn how decisions actually get made as opposed to how they get described afterward. Those are usually different things." A brief pause. "They are," Julian said. He wrote something. "What's one thing you already know you don't know? How much of strategy is actually strategy versus managing relationships?" He looked at her. The expression wasn't the interview expression from before, it was more direct than that, and slightly warmer. "That's a good answer," he said, and moved on. She understood after that it was the kind of compliment he didn't give lightly. She stored it and didn't think too much about it. The first 2 weeks had the quality of an extended calibration. She was assigned to the Strategic Development Group under a director named Karen Ellison, who was efficient and direct and said exactly what she meant at all times, which Susane found refreshing. The work was real, not the copy and photocopying kind of internship work, but actual analysis on actual projects with actual stakes. She was given a vendor evaluation project on the second day and told to have a preliminary memo ready by end of week, and she had it ready by Thursday afternoon. Karen read it Friday morning and said, "3 of your assumptions need flagging, but your methodology is sound. Revise and resubmit Monday." Susane revised it twice over the weekend and sent it at 7 a.m. Monday. Karen replied at 8. "Better. Good." She didn't see Julian much in those first 2 weeks. He appeared in the hallway occasionally moving between meetings, and he had a particular quality of motion, not hurried, never performatively busy, but purposeful in a way that made the space around him feel slightly organized. He greeted people by name, not just senior people. He knew the name of the woman who worked the reception desk and asked her once as he passed how her daughter's piano recital had gone, and the woman's face lit up in a way that was entirely unguarded. He knew the IT guy who came to reconfigure Susane's laptop on day 3 by his first name, and they exchanged 3 sentences about a basketball game before he went back to his meeting. She watched this and filed it. It contradicted something she'd been expecting to confirm. She wasn't sure what to do with it, so she kept watching. The company was housed across 4 floors of the building, and the culture had the specific flavor of a place that had been founded by someone who was still present. Not every large company had this quality. There were plenty where the founder existed only as a portrait in the lobby or a byline on the website, but Brown Tech felt from the inside like a place someone still cared about. Not sentimentally, practically. You could see it in the way meetings ran on time with agendas that were followed with decisions that were actually made, rather than deferred to the next meeting. You could see it in the way people emailed directly without excessive hedging with an expectation that they'd get an answer. On her 3rd Friday, she was staying late to finish an analysis that she wanted to have right before presenting it Monday. Most of the floor had emptied by 6. She was at her desk with her headphones off because she thought better without them, and she'd spread the relevant documents out across her second monitor. She heard footsteps in the corridor and assumed it was the cleaning crew. It was Julian Brown. He stopped at the door of the open workspace she was in. "Working late," he said, not a question. "I want the analysis right before Monday," she said. He leaned against the door frame in a way that was casual without being informal, if that distinction made sense. He was still in his jacket. "Which one?" "Vendor risk evaluation, Karen's project. The third-party logistics assessment." "Yes." He considered this. "What's your read so far?" She thought about it for 2 seconds. 2 of the 3 vendors have acceptable risk profiles. The third one's revenue concentration is a problem 43% from a single client. If that client consolidates, the vendor's margin narrows to the point where they can't service our contract reliably. He nodded slowly. "That's the right read." A beat. "Karen's going to argue the pricing advantage outweighs the risk," he said. "I know. I've been trying to figure out how to structure the argument.
How?
Quantify the downside scenario. Make the risk concrete instead of theoretical. People don't respond well to theoretical risk. He looked at her in that way she was starting to understand, not assessing her resume, but assessing the thing underneath it. That's a good instinct, he said. The specific number always beats the general concern. He pushed off the doorframe. Have a good weekend. You too, she said. He went back down the corridor. She sat with it for a moment, the easy directness of it, the absence of any condescension, the way he'd engaged with the actual content of what she was thinking instead of the fact that she was a 22-year-old intern working late on a Friday. She turned back to her monitor and kept working.
But
She was in the middle of her 4th week when she noticed something she almost didn't notice. It was a Tuesday afternoon and she'd been sent to the 8th floor for a document from the records room, a paper file which was unusual but not unheard of for older contracts. On her way back, she walked past a cluster of private offices near the main conference suite, and she heard 2 people talking behind a half-closed door. She wasn't listening. She had no reason to listen, but she caught it anyway. They can't trace it back to the source. The timing matters. Before the review, not after. Bisonge said. She kept walking. She didn't know what it was. It might have been anything, a normal conversation about any number of things that involved timing and sources. The company had dozens of ongoing projects. She was not going to construct a narrative from 2 overheard sentence fragments. But she noticed it. She had a particular quality that she'd learned to name only recently. She collected information the way other people collected receipts, without deciding in advance what any of it was for. Things sat in the back of her mind in a loose pile, until something else gave them a shape. She didn't always know when they'd become relevant. She just kept them. She went back to her desk and finished the afternoon's work. The following Monday, Karen called a team check-in that included the 4 interns and the 3 permanent team members on the Strategic Development Group. The main project review was focused on the Stellar Path contract, Brown Tech's largest active contract renewal, up for renegotiation in September. The contract was worth $47 million over 3 years, and involved supply chain integration software used across Stellar Path's entire North American distribution network. It was, Susane understood from context, the most significant renewal the company had in the current cycle. Karen walked them through the status. The negotiation team had had 2 preliminary conversations with Stellar Path. The relationship was good. The initial terms were being drafted. Susane listened and took notes. 2 days later, she overheard the conversation again. Not the same voices, not the same words, but the same register. She was in the kitchen getting coffee at 7:30 in the morning, and a man she'd seen in the hallway but couldn't name was on the phone near the window with his back to her. The proposal terms, and then his voice dropped, and then before Thursday. And then she'd taken her coffee and left because standing in the kitchen, straining to hear a phone call, was not something she was going to do. She sat at her desk and thought about it for a while. She thought about the Stellar Path renewal and the $47 million and the September timeline. She thought about the conversation she'd overheard on the 8th floor. She thought about the fact that she had 2 separate fragments that shared a quality she couldn't define except as the quality of things that were meant not to be overheard. She didn't say anything. Not yet. She had fragments, not evidence, and she'd been wrong before about impressions formed on incomplete information. But she paid attention. The man's name was David Harwick. She learned this by asking Karen a question about the team structure that was not quite a question about David Harwick, but that led to being given the organization chart, which included David Harwick, Senior Manager, Business Development. He was 41. He'd been at Brown Tech for 8 years. He had an easy, sociable quality in meetings, the kind of person who laughed at the right moments and gave presentations that felt effortless. Everyone seemed to like him. He'd mentored the previous cohort of interns Karen mentioned, and they'd all spoken highly of him. She watched him without being obvious about it. On Thursday of that week, she saw him go into the records room on the 8th floor, alone. He was there for 14 minutes. He came out carrying nothing visible. She went into the records room 20 minutes after he left on the pretext of returning the file she'd retrieved the previous week. She stood at the filing shelves for long enough to scan what was there. The Stellar Path contract file, she recognized it from the label, was on the shelf where it was supposed to be. She didn't touch it. She left. She sat at her desk and thought about it. She was a 22-year-old intern 4 weeks in. She didn't know this company. She had noticed three things that might mean nothing. She thought about what she'd said in the orientation. How much of strategy is actually strategy versus managing relationships? She thought about the $47 million. She went back to work.
But
Friday afternoon, 4:30. The strategic development floor was in its end-of-week settling, people finishing things up and letting themselves be slightly less precise about the hour. Susane was writing up the week's notes, a habit she'd developed more comprehensive than anything. She submitted a private log of what she'd seen and learned and noticed. Julian Brown appeared in the open doorway. She'd come to understand that he had a habit of walking the floors not as surveillance, but as something more like maintenance, keeping contact with the actual temperature of the place. He'd stop and exchange a few words with someone, ask a question, receive an update. It happened in a way that was more casual than it probably was. "How's the third week?" he asked. "Fourth," she said. "Is it?" He looked like he was running a quick count. "You're right. How's the fourth week?" "Good. The stellar path analysis is interesting." Something in his attention sharpened slightly, though his expression didn't change. "Karen's team?" "Yes." A beat. "Anything stand out?" She looked at him. She thought about what she had, three fragments, a pattern. She hadn't confirmed an impression she'd been wrong about once already. "Not yet," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than the question warranted. "Okay," he said. He pushed off the doorframe. "Good weekend." "You too," she said. He left. She sat with the "not yet" for a minute, turning it over. Then she added a section to her week's notes that she headed items to monitor. She wrote down what she'd seen, all of it, in order with dates. She didn't know yet what it meant. She was going to find out. The thing about being wrong was that it didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly in accumulation, the way you didn't notice the light changing until you looked up and the room was different. Susane had been at Brown Tech for 3 weeks when the first assumption cracked. Not shattered, not dramatically revised, just a hairline fracture in the certainty she'd arranged around Julian Brown in the 12 minutes between recognizing him in the interview room and leaving the building. She'd been prepared to be confirmed. She was a good observer. She'd always been a good observer, and the bar at Carmine's had given her what felt like sufficient data. A woman who'd shown up with obvious intent, a man who'd managed her out of the seat without giving her what she came for, a 40% tip that read less like generosity than cleanup. She'd filed it. She'd been ready to find the file was accurate. Instead, on her 4th day, she'd watched him walk across the office floor and stop at the desk of a systems engineer named Oliver, who'd been there for 11 years and who'd just learned his mother had been diagnosed with something that had the word progressive in it. Susane hadn't heard how Julian knew. She'd only heard that he did, and that he stopped and said something private and brief, and that Oliver had nodded in the way a person nods when they're concentrating very hard on not being affected by something. And then Julian had moved on, and Oliver had gone back to his screen, and nobody had made a thing of it. It was not a grand gesture. It was not filmable. It was just a man who noticed something and did the human thing. She'd noted it and moved on. But it sat in the pile. The second crack came in week 2, during the company-wide strategy update that Julian ran every other Tuesday in the main conference suite. This was not a formal meeting in the sense she'd expected. No PowerPoint, no prepared remarks. Just Julian at the head of a long table with 40-odd people arranged around and beyond it, most of them with laptops open and a running discussion of what was happening and what wasn't working. He asked questions directly. He pushed back directly. He credited people by name when they'd gotten something right, and he also, without any discernible drama, said things like, "That didn't work. What do we learn from it?" And the room didn't flinch, which meant either that people were performing a lack of flinching or that they'd actually internalized the question as normal. She sat near the back and watched the room. People engaged. Not in the defensive performance of engagement way she'd seen in other meetings, where the goal was to appear valuable without attracting scrutiny. People actually brought things they were still working through. A woman from the operations team said she'd been running a vendor process that she thought was getting less efficient rather than more, and could they revisit the framework? And Julian had said, yes, let's add it to next week's agenda, without any qualifier that would have made it into a performance of being approachable. She thought about the leadership seminars she'd sat through at Harvard. She thought about the case studies on organizational culture. She thought about all the consultants who wrote papers about exactly this kind of environment and how to manufacture it. He hadn't manufactured it. Or if he had, the seams weren't visible from here and she'd been looking. She was starting to understand that there might not be seams. That was the second crack. The stellar path analysis took up the better part of her fourth and fifth weeks. Karen assigned her to develop a risk matrix for the contract renewal, not just the vendor risk she'd already evaluated, but a fuller picture revenue dependency contract terms, relationship history, competitive landscape. It was the most substantial piece of work she'd been given, and she approached it the way she approached most substantial things, which was with a spreadsheet and a lot of black coffee and a mild and private anxiety that she didn't let near her face. She'd been tracking David Harwick in the background of all of it, not obviously, not in any way that could be noticed. She watched him in the Tuesday meetings. She noted when he left the floor and for how long. She paid attention to who he talked to and what the conversations looked like from 20 feet away, not the content which she couldn't hear, but the posture of them, the quick looks, the deliberate casualness. She had learned from growing up with not much money in a small town where the social fabric had textures people could read that certain kinds of performance were recognizable. She couldn't say precisely what Harwick was performing, but she recognized that he was performing something. On a Thursday, in her fifth week, she was in the records room, retrieving a contract comparison document, and she found the Stellar Path folder slightly displaced from where it had been. Not dramatically displaced. A centimeter, maybe two. The kind of displacement that happens when someone pulls a folder and replaces it without being perfectly precise. She did not touch it. She took the document she'd come for and left. Back at her desk, she updated her notes. Then she sat with this fundamental question she'd been avoiding. She was an intern in her fifth week, and she had a pattern she couldn't fully articulate, and the person at the center of it was a senior manager who'd been with the company for 8 years and was liked by everyone. She thought about what to do with this. She thought about the institutional risk of being wrong. She thought about the institutional risk of saying nothing. She thought about the $47 million. She thought about Julian Brown in the Friday evening conversation and the way he'd held on to not yet without commenting on it. She did not do anything that day, but she did not stop watching. The shift happened in week 6, and it was not dramatic. She was in the kitchen at 7:15 in the morning, her preferred arrival time early enough to think before the day started, and Julian was already there, which surprised her slightly. He was standing at the coffee machine with the particular focus of someone operating on less sleep than usual, and he was wearing the slightly more muted version of his usual suit that she'd come to associate with long days. "Good morning," he said without looking up. "Morning," she said. She waited for the coffee machine. He stepped aside and she took her cup and was about to leave when he said, "How's the Stellar Path matrix coming?" "I have a draft. I'm not satisfied with the competitive landscape section yet." "What's the problem?" She thought about it. "I don't have enough information about what Stellar Path's alternatives actually look like from their side. I can model it from our side, but I'm essentially guessing at their leverage." He picked up his coffee. "What would you need?" "Ideally, a conversation with someone who's been on the other side of a major Stellar Path negotiation in the last 5 years. I don't have access to that." "I do," he said. "Write down what you'd want to know. I'll see what I can do." She looked at him. Not because it was surprising that he'd help. It wasn't, but because the efficiency of it was slightly disarming. No process, no referral, just yes, and what do you need? "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and left. She stood with her coffee and thought not for the first time that the person she'd filed away at Carmine's and the person who'd just said, "I'll see what I can do," were not the same person. They were not even adjacent, which meant that the first impression had been wrong. And if the first impression had been wrong, then whatever else she'd built on top of it needed to be examined. She was not someone who found this pleasant to think about. She was someone who, once she'd identified a failure mode, corrected for it, and moved forward. She made a note to herself, brief and honest initial read on JB incorrect. Revise. Then she went to her desk and made the list of questions. He got her a call with a former VP of operations at a company that had negotiated a supply chain contract with Stellar Path 4 years ago. The call was arranged within 48 hours, conducted by phone 40 minutes, and gave her exactly the competitive landscape data she needed. It was not a favor in the personal sense. It was someone who owed Julian a professional courtesy returning it. The mechanism was ordinary. The effect on the matrix was significant. She revised the competitive landscape section with actual leverage modeling, and the risk picture changed. Stellar Path had less optionality than the preliminary draft had assumed, which meant BrownTech had more negotiating room than Karen's team was planning for. The contract could potentially be extended by 6 months on the same terms, a meaningful value difference. She finished the memo at 9:30 on a Tuesday night. She sat back in her chair and felt the particular satisfaction of something working. And then her phone lit up with an email from an unfamiliar internal address, and she clicked it open because unfamiliar addresses at 9:30 at night tended to matter. It was from a company email account she didn't recognize at first glance. The display name was generic. The content was 3 sentences. You're doing good work on the stellar path analysis. Be careful what you notice. Some things are better left unnoticed. She stared at it. The email address, when she looked at it carefully, was a variation on a standard brown tech address format, with one letter transposed real enough to pass a quick scan, wrong enough to be untraceable to an actual employee. She screenshot it, saved it, and then she sat at her desk for a long time. Not frightened. She wasn't frightened, but she was very still the way she got when something important needed to settle before she could proceed. After a while, she sent a reply to the address received. She didn't expect a response. She wanted it in the chain. Then she went to her notes and updated the log. She wrote the email text in full, the date and time, and a new category she hadn't had before contact. She went home at 10:15. She did not sleep until well past midnight, not because she was anxious, but because she was thinking. She found Julian in his office at 7:50 the next morning, which was the earliest she'd seen him there. His door was half open, which she'd come to understand was the version of open that meant knock if it's necessary. She knocked. He looked up. "Morning. I need to show you something," she said. "I'm sorry if it's early." "It's not early." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat down and opened her laptop and turned it to face him. She walked him through the log first. The 8th floor conversation. The records room visits, the morning phone call she'd partially overheard, the displaced folder, and then the email. He read the email without reacting and then read it again. She watched his face. What she saw was someone assembling pieces he had already begun assembling, which was different from what she'd expected. "When did you start noticing this?" he asked. "Week 4, she said. The first overheard conversation was in week 4. "Why didn't you come to me in week 4? "Because I had 2 sentence fragments and a pattern that might have been coincidence." She paused. "I wanted to be sure I wasn't constructing a story out of nothing." He held her gaze. "Okay, well," he said. He looked at the log again. "Who else have you talked to about this?" "No one." "Good. Keep it that way." He turned the laptop back to her. "Leave me a copy of this, the log and the email both. Do you want me to keep monitoring?" A beat. He looked at her with the particular attention he gave to something he was deciding carefully. "Yes," he said. Same approach, quietly. "You're not investigating anything formally. You're just noticing what you'd naturally notice." "I understand." "And Susane." It was the first time he'd used her first name at work. "If anything else comes to the email address or anything else feels like contact, you come to me first." That same day. "Yes," she said. She went back to her desk. The name thing sat with her for a moment before she let it go.
But
It was Raphael, the MIT Sloan intern, who broke the rhythm of the next 2 weeks. He'd been assigned to a separate project in the operations group, and she hadn't spent much time with him beyond the orientation, but he appeared at her desk on a Thursday lunch hour with a sandwich and a question, "Is it weird that I feel like I'm actually learning something here?" She looked at him. Why would that be weird? Because usually internships are either impressive sounding or useful, and usually not both. He sat in the empty chair across from her that nobody had claimed. "My last one, I spent 3 months building models nobody ever ran." "What are you building here?" "Something that might actually affect the ops review in September." He seemed surprised by this. "The failure condition question, I went back and I've been working on it for 2 weeks." She remembered Julian's question from the orientation and what had happened to Raphael's expression when he hadn't had an answer ready. "Did you figure it out?" 3 failure conditions, he said. "It's actually a better model now." A pause. "I think he did that on purpose." "Almost certainly," she said. Raphael looked at her. "You knew him before this, right?" "Someone said you'd met." "Briefly," she said. "He seemed to want more." She let him want it. They ate lunch in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and she thought that the 4 of them herself, Raphael, the 2 Wharton interns who were apparently dating each other in a way they thought was subtle, had developed something that wasn't quite friendship, but was more than professional proximity. The specific intimacy of people going through the same new thing. "He asked me a follow-up question this morning," Raphael said. "Just stopped in the hallway. Wanted to know if I'd gotten traction on the operations piece. Nobody at my last internship knew my name by week 6. He knows everyone's name, she said. Yeah. Raphael ate his sandwich. Weird kind of company to run when you're apparently worth $3 billion. Why is it weird? He thought about it. Most people who get to that point stop caring about the granular stuff. They manage the managing. He doesn't seem to have stopped. No, she said. He doesn't. She turned back to her screen, but she kept the thought. It was the same thought she'd been having in different forms for weeks, that the granular attention was the thing she'd expected to find absent, and finding it present instead had been the first and largest revision. The investigation, if you could call it that, developed on a parallel track to everything else. She did what Julian had asked, she watched, she noted, she said nothing. David Harwick continued his pattern. The records room, the morning phone calls, the easy sociability at meetings, that now had for her a slightly different texture. She couldn't prove anything. She was cataloging behavior, not evidence, but the log was getting longer. And then on a Thursday, in her 7th week, she learned something she hadn't expected. She was on the 9th floor for a vendor meeting that ran long, and on her way back she stopped in the restroom and overheard. Not because she was listening, because the stalls had poor acoustic separation, 2 members of the operations team talking at the sinks. She heard the name she'd been carrying for 2 weeks. Harwick's got something going on, one of them said. I heard something about the Stellar Path review, the other said. Third hand, take it for what it's worth. What kind of something? Somebody's shopping the renewal terms. A pause. Around. To competitors. That's a big deal. Maybe, or it's gossip. A tap running. The sound of paper towels. Who told you? Jenny in legal. She was in a meeting with outside counsel and one of them made a comment. Could be nothing. The door opened. They left. Susane stayed at the sink with the water running for 30 seconds after they were gone, shopping the renewal terms to competitors. If someone had taken the Stellar Path contract terms and shared them with a competitor. Before the renewal was finalized, the implications were significant. Stellar Path would know Brown Tech's pricing position. They would negotiate from information they shouldn't have. At $47 million, even a 10% difference in the final terms would be a multi-million-dollar loss. She thought about the displaced folder. She thought about the email at 9:30 at night. She turned off the tap and went back to the 11th floor and closed her notes, and thought for a long moment about what she had and what it meant. Then she picked up her phone and sent Julian a message. Available to talk today. His reply came in 7 minutes, 5:30. My office.
Yeah.
At 5:30, the floor was thinning. She went to his office and knocked on the half-open door. He was at his desk jacket, off sleeves rolled to mid-forearm, which she'd come to understand was his end-of-day configuration. He looked up and said, "Close the door?" And she did. She sat across from him. She told him what she'd overheard. She told him verbatim, as close as she could reconstruct it, and she was careful to label it as hearsay. Third hand, possibly, nothing her words. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he picked up his pen and set it down. Jenny in legal, he said. That's the name I heard. I don't know her. I do. He was thinking. This isn't a small thing, Susane. If contract terms got to a competitor before the renewal. Stellar Path's a large enough client that they'd have relationships with multiple vendors. If someone shopping our terms gets to their procurement team first, they negotiate against us with our own numbers, she said. Yes. He looked at her. How confident are you in what you heard? I wasn't trying to hear it. I can only tell you what I heard. I'm not questioning you. He said it without impatience. I'm calibrating. There's a difference. He pulled a legal pad toward him. I need to verify this independently before I can do anything with it. If this is what it sounds like, I need to handle it in a way that doesn't alert anyone who shouldn't be alerted. What do you want me to do? He held her gaze for a moment. He seemed to make a decision. Nothing different. Keep doing what you're doing. I'm going to talk to legal, quietly. He paused. You understand that this needs to stay between us? Yes. Not because I don't trust the team, he said, because I don't know who the team is in this yet. She understood that. Okay. She stood to go. He said, Susane. She turned. You've handled this well. He said it plainly without decoration. Better than most people would. She didn't know exactly what to do with that, so she said thank you and left. Walking back through the emptying floor, she thought about the way he'd said it, not as a reward or as flattery, but as a factual assessment. The same register as that's the right read, and that's a good instinct. Not performed. She'd received compliments she'd had to perform gratitude for. This wasn't that kind. She got her bag and her coat and took the elevator down. Outside Congress Street was doing its evening thing, foot traffic, a bus sighing at the curb, the harbor light going orange in the distance. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment before she started walking. She realized with some bemusement, invested. Not just in the work, though. She was invested in the work. In the outcome of this particular thing in the company and what happened to it, in the question of whether the contract would hold and whether the leak would be traced and whether the $47 million would land where it was supposed to. She was invested in whether Julian Brown's company would be okay. She thought about that for most of the walk to the Silver Line. The 2 weeks that followed had a particular texture, the compressed, slightly suspended feeling of waiting for something to resolve. She kept working. The matrix was finished and submitted, and Karen had said good work in the flat tone that meant she meant it. She'd been pulled into the edges of 2 other projects, a competitive analysis and an early-stage evaluation of a potential partnership. The work was good. She was learning things she couldn't learn in a classroom, not because the classroom was insufficient, but because some knowledge only existed in contact with actual stakes. She saw Julian regularly in the natural course of the workday. The Tuesday meetings, the hallway stops once at the coffee machine again early on a Wednesday. He was professional in the way he was always professional, and there was nothing in the interactions that named the thing they were tracking together, but there was something slightly different about the quality of his attention when it landed on her. More direct maybe, or maybe just more visible. She didn't read too much into it. She'd been wrong about her reads before, and she was in a period of deliberate epistemic humility on the subject. What she noticed instead was this. He asked better questions than almost anyone she'd encountered. Not the questions that were really statements, the kind designed to confirm something the asker had already decided, but genuine questions, the kind that arrived without their own conclusion, preloaded. He would ask something, and then wait for the actual answer, and then engage with the actual answer. It was, she thought, underrated as a skill. Most people didn't do it. Most people thought they did and didn't. In a Tuesday meeting in her 8th week, someone from the operations team proposed a cost reduction measure that was technically sound and practically catastrophic because it involved reducing headcount on a support team during a period when 2 major contracts were in their maintenance phase. The person who proposed it was not stupid. She'd worked out the numbers correctly. She'd just optimized for one variable. Julian listened to the whole proposal. Then he asked 3 questions, each of which added a variable the proposer hadn't included. By the 3rd question, the proposer herself said, "Oh, that changes the calculus." "Does it change it to a no, or does it change it to a different version?" Julian asked. "A different version," she said. "Give me 2 weeks." "You've got 2 weeks," he said, and moved to the next item. Susane had written in her private log that evening, "He doesn't need to be right out loud." Most people in his position had been right out loud so many times, it became the only way they knew how to think. The end of week 9 was a Thursday that ran until 8. She'd been roped willingly into the tail end of a partnership evaluation meeting that had started at 3 and gone long because the financials were more complicated than the preliminary numbers had suggested. By 7:30, she was the only intern still in the room, the rest having sensibly left by 6, and there were 4 senior people and herself around a table with cold coffee and annotated spreadsheets. At 8, Julian walked in. "Why is this still happening?" he said, not unkindly. Karen looked at the ceiling, the revenue share structure. He sat down at the end of the table, pulled one of the annotated spreadsheets toward him, looked at it for about 90 seconds. Then he said, "The problem is you're treating the first-year revenue share as fixed. It's not fixed. It's a negotiating variable. Make it variable with a floor and you solve the structure issue." A pause in the room. "That would require going back to the partner with a revised term sheet," someone said. "Yes," Julian said. "Is that a problem?" "They wanted a decision by Friday. Tell them the decision is proceeding and we need until Monday to finalize one term. They'll wait." He stood up. "Go home. All of you." He caught Susane's eye briefly. "You especially. You've been here since 7:30 in the morning." "How do you know that?" "Because I came in at 8 and your light was already on." He picked up his jacket from the back of a chair. "Go home, Susane." She went home. On the train, she thought about the light on at 7:30 and whether he noticed which lights were on as a matter of general practice or as something else. She thought she probably didn't know and that this was appropriate. She thought about the revenue share problem and the 90 seconds it had taken him to find the variable everyone else had treated as fixed. She thought this was not luck. It was the specific competence of someone who had been thinking about problems of this shape for 20 years and who was not, despite 20 years of success, performing it. She'd been wrong about him. She'd been wrong quickly and confidently, and she'd been wrong for weeks before she'd started to revise. And even then, she hadn't fully revised until now, sitting on the silver line with the harbor visible through the window, understanding that what she'd dismissed at midnight in a bar had been a real person doing a real thing and that she'd seen the wrong frame of it. She wasn't sure yet what the right frame was, but she was starting to understand that he was someone worth the patience of finding out. The thing she hadn't anticipated was that he would be funny. Not performatively funny, not the kind of humor that announced itself or that required acknowledgement, but quietly, obliquely, with a dryness that surfaced at unexpected moments and then retreated before you could quite be certain you'd seen it. In a meeting in her 10th week, a vendor representative gave a presentation that lasted 45 minutes and communicated approximately 11 minutes of information. When it ended, Julian asked one clarifying question, received a 5-minute answer that added nothing, and then said very pleasantly, "Thank you, we'll be in touch," in a tone that communicated to everyone in the room that they would not be in touch. After the vendor had been escorted out the room, held a brief mutual silence. Julian looked down at his notes and then at no one in particular. "I've blocked 3 hours for vendor meetings today," he said. "I'd like 45 of those minutes back." Karen laughed first, then everyone did, and it broke something that had been slightly taut in the room. Susane had been looking down at her own notes, and she looked up at the sound of it, and Julian caught her eye for a moment across the table. Not long. A second. But there was something in it, the shared recognition of a thing that was simultaneously funny and slightly absurd, that had the specific quality of being between two people rather than general. She looked back down at her notes. She added it to the pile of things she was not reading too much into. The information she'd been waiting for came on a Friday in her 11th week, and it did not come from Julian. It came from Dana, who appeared at Susane's desk at 4 in the afternoon and said quietly, "Mr. Brown would like to know if you're free at 5:30. "Yes," Susane said. "Conference room B, 9th floor." She went at 5:30. The room had Julian and a woman she hadn't met before, mid-40s. Dark suit, the specific quality of stillness that Susane had come to associate with lawyers. Julian introduced her as Margaret Cole, General Counsel. They sat. "The information you brought me has been verified," Julian said. He said it directly without preamble. "The source of the leak is someone on the business development team. We know the general scope. We're now working on the specific mechanism." She held that for a second. She'd known it was coming. She'd known for weeks. But there was still something slightly arresting about hearing it confirmed. "The team member in question," Margaret said, "made contact with a competitor in week 4 of the current renewal cycle. We believe he provided preliminary terms, not finalized terms, but a close approximation." She paused. "Your observation of the records room access was part of what helped us reconstruct the timeline." Susane didn't say anything. "We're still gathering documentation," Margaret continued. "There will be an HR process, and depending on what we find, potentially legal action. You should know that." "I understand," Susane said. Julian was watching her. Not the assessing look of the interview or even the careful look of the early conversations. Something slightly different. "How are you with it?" he said. She thought about the honest answer. "It's what I thought it was," she said. "I'm glad I wasn't wrong." "You weren't wrong," he said. "You were right, and you handled it the right way." "Who is it?" she asked. She knew the answer, but she wanted to hear it said plainly. "David Harwick," he said. She'd known. She'd known for weeks, but hearing it had its own weight. "He's been here 8 years, she said. "Yes." Julian said it without inflection, which she understood to be the right inflection. There was no version of this that was simple. "Did he know you were looking?" "Probably not yet," Julian said. "The next few days will determine that." She nodded. She thought about what came next, the HR process, the documentation, whatever legal action looked like, the effect on the $47 million, and the September timeline. She thought about the 45 minutes it had taken her to decide in week 4 whether 2 sentence fragments constituted anything worth noting. "What happens to the Stellar Path renewal?" she asked. "We're managing it," Julian said. "The terms they have access to are preliminary enough that we can still negotiate around them. It's not ideal, but it's manageable." "Okay," she said. She stood to go. Julian said, "Stay a minute." Margaret closed her folder and stood. "I'll give you a call Monday, Julian," she said. She nodded at Susane. Miss Coldson. And she left. The room was briefly quiet. You started noticing this in week 4, Julian said. Yes. And you didn't say anything for 3 weeks. I had fragments. I told you why. I know. He leaned back in his chair. I'm not criticizing it. I'm thinking about it. He paused. Most people in your position would have done one of 2 things. Come to me too early with too little, or decided it wasn't their business and said nothing. Those were the wrong options, she said. They were. He looked at her. I don't think most people would have known that. She thought about the filing cabinet in her head, the loose pile of things that didn't have a shape until something gave them one. She thought about the greenfield quality of her peripheral vision, the small-town child's particular attunement to the textures of social performance, to what people were performing and why. She'd never named it as a skill. It was just how she'd grown up. I grew up in a place where things that mattered mostly went unsaid, she said. You learn to watch. He held her gaze for a moment. Where'd you grow up? Western Massachusetts, a town called Greenfield. He was quiet for a moment. I grew up in Worcester, he said. Half an hour away. She hadn't known that. She hadn't thought to research it. The proximity was small, but it landed in a particular way. The same gray winter. The same Dunkin' Donuts on every corner. The same understanding that Boston was a different country, even though it was close enough to drive to. Then you know, she said. I know, he said. They sat with that for a moment, which was an unusual thing to do in a professional setting and which neither of them remarked on. Go home, he said finally, with a slight shift in his voice, less CEO and more just human. It's been a long week. It has, she said. She walked to the door. Behind her, he said, Thank you, Susane, for all of it. She turned back. He was looking at his notepad, not at her, which made the sincerity of it more visible rather than less. You're welcome, she said. She meant it. She went home. On this train, she thought about Worcester and Greenfield and the half hour of highway between them. She thought about what it meant to know a place, not a landmark, not a famous thing about it, but the specific texture of it, the color of the winter light, the way small towns held their silences. She thought about how much she hadn't known about him 3 weeks ago, and how much she still didn't know, and how the curve of that was becoming something she wanted to continue. She came in the following Monday to find an email from Julian's calendar with a meeting request strategy review stellar path renewal. That afternoon, her name and Karen's and 2 names from the legal team. She read it twice. She was an intern in her 11th week. Strategy reviews for $47 million contracts were not standard intern territory. She accepted the meeting request. The session ran for 2 hours and covered the renegotiation strategy in full, where they had room to move, where they didn't, how to address the fact that preliminary terms had been exposed without triggering a panic in Stellar Path's procurement team. Julian ran the session. Susane contributed twice with specific pieces of analysis from the matrix she'd built. Both times Julian incorporated what she said without acknowledgement that it was unusual for her to be there. But Karen looked at her once across the table with an expression that was hard to read, and that Susane thought meant, I'm updating my assessment of what you are. After the meeting, walking back through the floor, Raphael appeared from nowhere and fell into step beside her. Was that the Stellar Path session? He asked. Yes. You were in there for 2 hours. Yes. He looked at her. You're not going to tell me what happened? No. He processed this. Fair, he said. He went back to his desk. She went to hers. She sat for a moment looking at the open document on her screen. The competitive landscape analysis, she'd been refining the modeling she'd done the data from the call Julian had arranged. She thought about the log that had started as a record of things she wasn't sure mattered and had ended up in a conference room with general counsel. She thought about the follow-through of it, the patience of it, the willingness to sit with fragments until they formed something real. It was not how she'd described herself before. She'd described herself as decisive, quick-reading, confident in first impressions. She was revising the self-description. She was learning specifically to hold a thing without closing around it, to let it take its time. She wasn't sure yet whether that was the company she was learning it from or the person running it. She suspected the distinction might not matter. The end of that week, Friday afternoon, the floor was doing its usual settling. 4:30 had the quality of permission, not officially over, but close enough that people's energy was already pointing toward the weekend. She was finishing a memo when her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. You reported me. I know. She stared at it. Then she forwarded it to Julian with the sender's number and one line Harwick. His reply came in 4 minutes. I'm handling it now. Thank you. She turned her phone face down on her desk and sat with the slightly altered temperature of the afternoon. She wasn't afraid exactly, but she was aware acutely suddenly that this had moved out of the abstract category of a pattern she was noticing and into the concrete category of a person who knew her name. She thought about what she'd said to Julian in week 4. Not yet. She thought about how far she was from that Friday afternoon. Now not in time, but in understanding. The not yet had become yes. The pattern had become a person. The fragments had become a fact, and the fact she thought was going to get harder before it got simpler. She picked up her bag. She said goodbye to the few remaining people on the floor. She took the elevator down. On Congress Street, she stopped and stood for a moment in the late June warmth. The harbor was visible at the end of the block. A ferry was crossing. She thought about the man on the other side of the building in his office, handling it now. She thought about Worcester and Greenfield. She walked to the Silver Line. Behind her, the text was sitting in her phone, and the investigation was crossing from something she'd been quietly running into, something that was about to run them both. She didn't know that yet. She almost knew it. The Harwick situation resolved in the way most institutional crises resolve, not with a dramatic confrontation or a clean verdict, but with a series of closed-door meetings, HR documentation, and a Tuesday morning when his desk was empty and no one in the office acknowledged it directly. Susane heard about it from Karen, who told her in the flat, factual way Karen told her most things. David Harwick is no longer with the company. The Stellar Path renewal is proceeding on the original timeline. You should know that your analysis contributed significantly to our ability to manage the exposure. Thank you, Susane said. I'm not saying it to be nice, Karen said. I'm saying it because it's accurate, and because you should have accurate information about the value of your work. She went back to her desk and sat with that for a moment. The value of your work. She thought about the log she'd started in week 4 with its 2-sentence fragments, the careful accumulation of small observations over the following weeks, the way she'd held it all without closing around it until she had enough. She thought about all the ways she could have gotten it wrong, moved too fast, constructed a narrative on insufficient data, brought it to the wrong person at the wrong moment. She thought about the text from Harwick's phone. You reported me. I know. She had not heard anything further after that. Julian had said handling it now, and apparently handling it, had included whatever needed to be said about contact with interns. She wasn't naive enough to think there was no residual risk, but she was pragmatic enough to understand that the residual risk was now someone else's problem to manage. She turned back to her screen. The weeks that followed had a different quality. Not calmer exactly, the Stellar Path renewal moved into its active negotiation phase, and the pace on the strategic development floor increased accordingly, but different in a way she took a few days to identify. What had changed was that she was no longer carrying something privately. The log was in Julian's hands, and the legal team's hands, and Karen's awareness, and the thing she'd been holding separately from everything else had been folded into the ordinary fabric of the workday. She was simply working, and the work was very good. The partnership evaluation project she'd been pulled into resolved in the affirmative. The revised term sheet was accepted. The deal moved to contract stage, and Karen told her to document her methodology for the analysis because it was going into the department's reference files. She started on a new competitive mapping project that had her building contact with people in the analytics division on the 14th floor, which gave her a view into a part of the company she hadn't had before. She was learning brown tech the way you learn any complex thing, not by comprehending it all at once, but by accumulating small true pieces until the shape of the larger thing became visible. Julian she saw in this regular pattern of the Tuesday meetings and the occasional hallway exchange. But something had shifted, not dramatically, not in any way she could have cited at a given moment. The hallway exchanges were slightly longer. He'd stop and ask about a specific piece of the work rather than a general, "How's it going?" Once he mentioned something about the competitive mapping in a way that told her he'd looked at the preliminary findings she'd sent to Karen, though he said nothing about having looked at them. Once she made a dry observation about a vendor presentation, and he looked at her with the corner of his mouth doing something that stopped just short of a smile, and that too was slightly different from before. She didn't name it. She was in a period of deliberate care about naming things. The late session started in week 13. Not at her instigation, Julian called a strategy session for the Stellar Path renewal that ran past 6, and then another that ran past 7. And after the third one, Karen left at 6:30, with the specific efficiency of someone who had learned to trust her team to close without her. And it became the pattern that Julian and Susane were the last two in the conference room. She thought about this carefully and concluded that it was organically arrived at rather than manufactured. The renewal was in the complex middle phase of negotiation, the part where the framework was set and the variables were being worked through one by one, each one affecting the others in a non-linear way that required a specific kind of attention. Julian worked this kind of problem the way she'd noticed him work all problems present, unhurried, with the patience of someone who knew that compression rarely produced a better answer. She was good at this work. She knew she was good at it not from vanity, but from the specific and observable fact that the things she contributed in these sessions affected the negotiating position. Julian used the phrase right, and occasionally said things like, "Where did you get that?" in a tone that was more curious than rhetorical. It was in one of these sessions, the fourth or fifth on a Thursday, in her 13th week, that the conversation moved past the Stellar Path file. They'd been at it for 2 hours. The room had the end-of-session quality papers, slightly spread coffee long cold, the ambient hum of the building settling into its night configuration. Julian closed the spreadsheet he'd had open and sat back in a way that communicated they were done with the formal portion. "Good session," he said. "I think the exclusivity clause is solvable," she said. "Give me the weekend with it." "Take the weekend." He looked at the table, not at her. "You're graduating in May, right?" The shift in register caught her slightly off guard. "Yes, May 15th. What comes after?" She thought about how to answer. The true answer was layered. "I have 3 offers I'm evaluating," she said. He looked at her then. "Here, Brown Tech is one of them," she said, careful. "I'm looking at 2 others, one in New York consulting firm, one in San Francisco early-stage company." He nodded once. He did not say anything about what he'd prefer, which she noticed, and which she thought was the correct choice. "What does San Francisco look like?" he said. "High upside, high risk. The company's pre-revenue. They have good Series A backing, but the product is 18 months from market at optimistic estimate." "What does New York look like?" "Safe. Good track record. The work would be solid for the first 2 years, then probably predictable for the next 3. And here," she held his gaze. "I know what the work looks like," she said. A pause. "What are you optimizing for?" She thought about it. "The truth," she said. "Preferably. I'm trying to figure out whether I'm the kind of person who makes their best decisions in controlled environments or in volatile ones." She looked at her coffee cup. "I don't have enough data yet." He was quiet for a moment. "How long did it take you to make the decision to bring the Harwick log to me?" She thought back. "I started the log in week 4. I brought it in week 7. 3 weeks, he said. "Yes? You had enough to act in week 5, probably 4.5. He said it without judgment. "You waited until you had enough to be right." "I wasn't sure I had enough in week 5. "I know, but you did." He looked at the window. Controlled environments reward precision. Volatile environments reward judgment. You have both. The question is which one you value more at this stage. She thought about that. "What did you value more at this stage?" she asked. It was a slightly different kind of question from the one she'd been asking in these sessions, not about the contract, not about the work. He seemed to notice the difference. He was quiet for a moment before answering. "I valued being in the room where decisions actually got made," he said. "Whatever the room cost." He paused. "I chose the volatile option. Twice. The first time it almost didn't work and I learned things I couldn't have learned any other way." "What did you learn?" He looked at her directly. "That I was right more often than I was wrong, and that being wrong didn't kill the enterprise. Those are the 2 things you need to know if you're going to build something." She sat with that. "The San Francisco company," she said. "How much risk is real versus how much is the story they're telling to recruit?" Something shifted in his face, the quality that appeared when she said something that landed precisely where he hadn't expected. "What makes you think there's a gap?" "Pre-revenue 18 months to market Series A. In the current funding environment, that timeline has a lot of assumptions built in. If any of the assumptions slip manufacturing regulatory adoption curve, the timeline extends and the capital position changes." "Have you looked at their cap table?" "Not yet. I was going to ask them for it." "Ask them for it, Chet," he said. "The cap table tells you how much runway they actually have and what happens to your equity position if they need a bridge round." He paused. "It also tells you how seriously they take diligence. How they respond to the question says as much as the table itself." She wrote it down. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the harbor was dark, the lights of East Boston's terminals visible across the water in a low, scattered line. "You grew up careful," he said. "Not a question." "Greenfield wasn't the kind of place where you got to be careless," she said. "Worcester wasn't either." He turned his coffee cup in the way he had the same gesture she'd noticed at Carmine's, though she'd read it wrong then. "I paid for the first semester of college with money I'd saved working construction summers since I was 15. The second semester I worked for a professor doing data entry and wrote my first line of actual code on his machine after he went home." She had not known that. She'd known the company's founding story, the 2001 narrative, the garage office mythology that appeared in every profile, but not this. "The company started from that," she said. "The company started from 11 years after that," he said. "I worked for other people's companies for a decade first. Learned what I'd need to learn. Built enough relationships that when I was ready, I had a network instead of a cold start." He paused. "I was 35 when I founded Brown Tech. That part doesn't make the profiles as often." "Why not?" "Because the narrative is better if you're young and brilliant and launch from a garage," he said with the dry tone she'd come to recognize. 35 years old and 12 years of experience is a less exciting story. It's a more accurate one. "Yes," he said. "It is." She thought about the gap, the 11 years between the code line on the professor's machine and Brown Tech's founding. She thought about what patience looked like at the scale of a decade. She'd always thought of herself as patient about process and impatient about outcome, and she was starting to understand that those might not be separable in the way she'd assumed. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "The woman at Carmine's." She said it plainly. It had been sitting between them since March, not named, not referenced, but present. "I made assumptions." He looked at her with the slight shift in attention she'd come to read as careful. "What kind of assumptions?" "Unfavorable ones." She held his gaze. "I was wrong." A pause. "You saw one interaction at midnight," he said, with incomplete context. "That's what I said to myself afterward. It's true. It's also a partial explanation for a larger pattern." She looked at the table. "I do that. I form a read quickly and I close around it. I'm working on the closing part." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a boat horn sounded low and brief. "She was someone I'd dated briefly 2 years ago," he said. "She wanted to revisit it. I didn't." He said it without elaboration, the way he said most things. "What you saw was the end of that conversation." "I know," she said. "I figured it out, weeks later." "What clued you in?" "The way you handled the check," she said. "The tip was generous. You weren't feeling guilty, you were being fair. Those are different signatures." He looked at her for a moment. "You read expense claims the way you read people." "I read everything as data," she said. "The problem is, the analysis is only as good as the frame." "What frame did you have at midnight at Carmine's?" "The wrong one," she said simply. He almost smiled. "Not quite." "For what it's worth," he said, "I noticed the attitude." "I know you did." "And I noticed it change." She looked up. He was looking at her with the direct version of his attention, not the CEO version, not the interviewer version. Something more unmediated. "It changed because I was wrong," she said. "That's usually how it works," he said. The room held something, not exactly tension, but the quality of a moment that knew it was a moment. She was aware of the distance across the table and the late hour, and the fact that they were alone in the building's low hum. She was aware of not reading too much into it. "I should go," she said. He nodded. "Have a good weekend." She gathered her things. At the door, she turned back because something in the angle of him, still at the table facing the window, slightly more alone-looking than he'd appeared all week, made her pause. "Julian," she said. He turned. She wasn't sure what she'd meant to say. "Thanks for the San Francisco advice." "Cap table," he said. "Cap table," she confirmed. She left. In the elevator, she stood with her bag in her hands and thought about 35 and 12 years, and the professor's computer after he went home. She thought about the way patience looked from the inside, not passive, not resigned, but just the steady accumulation of the things that would eventually be necessary. She thought about the window and the harbor lights, and the way the room had felt when she'd used his first name. She took the train home. The weekend happened, and then the following week happened. The exclusivity clause resolved the way she'd thought it would, with a structural adjustment that gave Stellar Path what they needed without compromising Brown Tech's position. Karen said good. Julian, in the Tuesday meeting, noted the resolution and credited her methodology with the precision she'd come to expect from him. No fanfare, just Susane's approach to the exclusivity question gave us a path through. Good work. She felt Priya's voice in her head. See? She silenced it. There was a particular kind of self-consciousness that came with being noticed in a professional setting, and she'd learned to manage it to take in the acknowledgement without losing the thread of the work. But acknowledgement from him had a slightly different quality, partly because she'd spent 3 months watching him acknowledge everyone with the same precision and understanding that it was not casual, partly because of the late sessions, partly because of the conversation. She didn't let it become anything. She was being careful. The mentor revelation came in week 14, and it came from Priya. Priya had taken a summer consulting gig at a firm in Back Bay, and they'd developed a Tuesday night dinner habit at the cheap Thai place 2 blocks from Susane's apartment. It was the kind of ritual that required no planning. They'd been meeting there since sophomore year through exam periods and bad dates, and the February her scholarship committee had required a supplemental financial disclosure that had taken 3 nights to assemble. It was the fixed point. On the 3rd Tuesday of July, Priya was talking about a client situation, and Susane was eating her pad CU and half listening while turning over a piece of the competitive mapping analysis. And Priya said, "And apparently there's some drama at Brown Tech." Susane looked up. "You know someone there, right?" Priya said. "The internship." "What drama?" Susane said. "I heard it second or third hand." Priya drank her water. "Someone in our office worked with a Brown Tech vendor. There's apparently a situation with a business development person who left. Something about leaking contract terms." "That's being handled," Susane said carefully. Priya looked at her. "You know about it?" "Yes." "Do you know more than you're telling me?" "Yes." Priya processed this in the way she processed most information, quickly, without drama. "Okay," she said. "What's the part you can tell me? That it's resolved more or less. The person is gone." "Good." Priya ate a spring roll. "Word travels fast in consulting circles. That's all I'm saying." She paused. "Also, people want to know who noticed it." Susane looked at her food. "They're saying it was an intern," Priya said. "She wasn't fishing. She was informing, which is the kind of thing people talk about." "I'm aware," Susane said. "Is that a problem?" She thought about it. "I don't know yet." Priya looked at her with the specific expression she reserved for moments when she thought Susane was being less than fully honest with herself. It was not an unkind expression. "How are things going broadly?" "Good," Susane said. "Really good." "Professionally?" "Yes, professionally." "And otherwise?" She looked at Priya. "I don't know what you mean." "You do," Priya said pleasantly. "You're just deciding whether to tell me." Susane ate her noodles. "There's nothing to tell." "I believe you," Priya said. "I also think nothing to tell is sometimes a specific status rather than an absence of one." "That is a very precise observation." "I'm a consultant," Priya said. "Precision is the product." Susane was quiet for a moment. "He's 46, she said. Priya didn't blink. "Okay, that's not a nothing statement." "I know. I'm his intern." "I know that too." Susane set down her fork. "Nothing has happened. I'm not allowing anything to happen." "I understand that," Priya said. "I'm not asking what's happened. I'm asking what you're carrying." This was the thing about Priya. She had a specific talent for finding the distinction that simplified everything. Not by making it smaller, but by making it accurate. Susane picked up her fork again. "Something I didn't expect," she said. "Something specific or something general?" "A person," she said, "specifically." Priya nodded once and didn't say anything else about it, which was also a specific talent. They ate their dinner. They talked about Priya's client situation and about the fall semester and about whether the Thai place had changed its sauce recipe for the pad CU. They talked about Susane's mother, who had gotten a promotion at the hospital where she'd worked for 20 years and had called twice in the past week to share the news. They talked about the cap table question and the San Francisco company, and Priya said, "You're not going to San Francisco." "I might." "You're not," Priya said. "I've known you for 4 years. You're not a San Francisco person." "What's a San Francisco person? Comfortable with ambiguity they haven't structured themselves," Priya said. "You're comfortable with your own ambiguity. Other people's ambiguity you want to analyze first. That seems like a character flaw." "It's a feature," Priya said, "depending on the environment." Susane paid for her half of dinner, which was what they always did. Neither of them was at the point where covering the other felt natural rather than loaded. She walked home in the July night that had the particular warmth of Boston in summer, the harbor smell coming from the direction of the water. She was carrying something she didn't know the name for yet. She knew it was real because it had weight. She went home and looked at the cap table question and thought about patience. She had not been expecting Karen's Thursday afternoon conversation. She was at her desk, and Karen stopped by, not unusual. Karen stopped by with feedback or questions 2 or 3 times a week, but this time she sat down in the side chair rather than staying standing, which was the signal that this was longer than a quick exchange.
I want to talk to you about the fall, Karen said.
Okay, Susane said. We've been in conversation with Julian about the internship, Karen said. Your position specifically. There's a question of converting the intern role into a permanent offer at graduation, which I understand is something the HR team is going to talk to you about formally. She paused. I wanted to talk to you informally first, off the record. Okay, Susane said again. The formal offer will be good, Karen said. Strong comp, meaningful scope, real work from day one. That's my input on it. She looked at Susane with the direct expression she always wore. My off-the-record input is this: you've been here 14 weeks. You've done work that someone 2 years ahead of you would have done well, and you've done it as a first-year intern. That is not standard.
Thank you, Susane said. I'm not finished, Karen said. The other piece. There's a visible quality to your relationship with Julian. I don't mean that critically. I mean it as an observation you should have.
Susane was very still. People notice things, Karen said. Especially when someone is brought into a senior strategy session for a $47 million renewal as a 14-week intern. The late sessions, the direct conversations. She paused. None of that is a problem if you're taking the permanent offer because you want the work. All of it becomes a problem if the perception is something else. It's the work, Susane said. I believe you, Karen said. I'm telling you that belief isn't uniform. She stood. The offer is coming in the next 2 weeks. Think about it carefully. That's all. She left. Susane sat at her desk and looked at her screen and thought about perception and about what it meant to have the thing you'd earned look like something you'd been given. She thought about the $47 million and the log and the exclusivity clause and the 3 years at Carmine's and the second-hand suit and the dry cleaning. She thought about the cap table question she'd asked herself rather than waiting for someone to give her the answer. She thought about Karen's face, not hostile, not protective, but frank in the way Karen was about most things. Karen believed it was the work. The hedge was for the people who didn't know her, and those people existed, and that was a real thing. She stayed at her desk for a long time after that. She got a lot done. She told Julian about the Karen conversation. Not immediately, she thought about it for 2 days first. She told him on a Monday morning in the kitchen early when they were the only 2 people on the floor yet. Karen talked to me about the perception issue, she said. He turned from the coffee machine. His face did the careful thing. When, Thursday. What did she say? That the late sessions and the stellar path meeting and the direct conversations are visible. And that visible is fine if I'm there because of the work, and a potential problem if the perception becomes something else. She held his gaze. She said it wasn't a criticism. I believed her. He was quiet for a moment. Karen's right to name it, he said. I know. And she came to you rather than to me, which is also right. He poured his coffee. I should have thought about that more deliberately. I don't think you did anything wrong, she said. I don't think I did either, he said. I think I prioritized the work and didn't think enough about what it looks like from outside. He turned to face her. I'm going to keep working with you the same way I've been working with you. The Stellar Path review and everything after it. That doesn't change. Okay, she said. But I'll think more carefully about the optics of the sessions, he said. That's on me. It's not only on you. He looked at her. No, he said. It's not. A brief, precise pause, the kind that held more than what had been said. I'm still thinking about the offer, she said. Take your time, he said. The timeline isn't urgent. She took her coffee and went to her desk. She was not going to think about what had just been in the pause. She was going to work. She worked. The kiss happened in week 15, and she had not planned it, and she did not think he had either, and it arrived in the way that true things arrive, not from nowhere, but from the accumulated weight of every other thing that had come before it. It was a Wednesday. The Stellar Path negotiation had closed its most complex section the previous Friday, and the team had gone for drinks to market. Nothing excessive. A few people from strategic development at the bar, 2 blocks from the office, an hour and a half of the specific decompression that followed a months-long push. She'd been there. Julian hadn't been there, which was a deliberate choice that she understood his presence would have changed the temperature of the room. On Wednesday, she'd stayed late again, genuinely late past 9, because the competitive mapping project had a deadline she'd committed to, and she wanted to meet it. Most of the floor was empty. She'd had her headphones in for the last hour, which was her deep work configuration. She heard the knock on the doorframe before she saw him. She took the headphones out. He was in the doorway with his jacket over his arm, having clearly come from whatever his day had been. "You're still here," he said. "Deadline tomorrow," she said. "I'm close." He looked at the screen. He walked in, not all the way, but further than the door, and stood at the near corner of her desk and looked at the mapping spread across her second monitor. "Third quadrant's the problem," he said. "I know. The data's thin." He leaned slightly to look at the screen better. He was close enough that she could smell the faint particular quality of the end of a long day coffee adjacent, slightly warmer than the room. She kept her eyes on the screen. "You've got 4 data points in the third quadrant," he said. "What's your confidence interval?" "Low. I've been flagging it as preliminary." "Can you cross-reference with the industry analysis from the spring?" He reached past her to indicate a section of the chart close enough that she was aware of the closeness, and she looked at where he was pointing and not at him. "I hadn't thought of that," she said. "The spring analysis would have the secondary market data. It's in the shared drive, analytics folder." "I'll pull it," she said. He stepped back. She turned toward him to confirm she'd understood, and the timing of it was what it was. She turning and him still close, the quiet of the empty floor, the week of work behind them, and the weeks behind that. She didn't know who moved. She thought possibly neither of them exactly. She thought it might have been more like gravity, which was not romantic language, but was accurate language. The accumulated pull of everything that had been building since March arriving in that moment at a point where it had no further to go. The kiss was soft, not exploratory, not uncertain in the way that first kisses were often uncertain. It had the quality of something recognized rather than discovered. It lasted a moment. They separated. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything immediately. Then he said very quietly, "That wasn't nothing." "No," she said. "It wasn't." He stepped back, not retreating, just giving the moment room. "I need you to know that I'm aware this is complicated," he said. "I know," she said. "The internship ends in August," he said. 6 weeks, she said. "Yes." He held her gaze. "I'm not going to pretend the timing doesn't matter." "It matters," she agreed. "And I'm not going to tell you what to do with the offer," he said. "That can't be part of this." "I know that too," she said. He nodded once. He looked at her for another moment with the unmediated version of his attention. Then he said, "Finish the mapping. Pull the analytics data." "Okay," she said. He put his jacket back on. At the door he paused. "Susane." She looked at him. "I'm glad you got the job," he said. "Whatever comes next." He left. She sat at her desk for a long moment. Outside the window, the harbor was dark and the terminal lights were on. The building was quiet around her. She was very still. Then she pulled up the analytics folder in the shared drive and found the spring analysis and opened it and cross-referenced the third quadrant and filled in the data. She had a deadline. She met it.
Patam.
She did not tell Priya about the kiss. Not because she was hiding it, she didn't think she was hiding it, but because naming it would require her to have it figured out. And she didn't have it figured out. She had a soft kiss in a quiet office at 9 at night, and a not-nothing that she knew exactly what it meant, and a complicated situation that both of them had acknowledged was complicated, and that was where things were. She thought about it on the train home. She thought about it in the morning. She filed it somewhere careful where it could sit without crowding everything else. On Thursday, they had the regular Tuesday meeting, which had been rescheduled. Julian was at the head of the table. He ran the meeting the way he always ran the meeting. He called on her twice in the course of it. His voice had the same register. His attention on her had the same precision. Nothing was different. Everything was. That was the only way she could describe it, and it was not entirely satisfying as a description, but it was accurate. She thought about what he'd said. "I'm not going to tell you what to do with the offer. That can't be part of this." She thought about it the way she thought about the good things he said, not dismissing it, not losing it, but turning it over until she understood its exact shape. He meant it. She was certain he meant it. That was the part she was trying to figure out how to carry.
T.
The mentor piece arrived not from within the company, but from outside it, which was the part she hadn't anticipated. In week 16 on a Friday afternoon that had the early release quality of a summer Friday, she got a call from a number she recognized, Professor Alan Whitfield, her organizational behavior professor, the one who had annotated her cover letter for the Brown Tech application with 3 pages of notes. "I hear good things," he said when she answered. "From the industry side." "That's nice to hear," she said. She stepped away from her desk to the corridor. "How are you?" "Fine, fine. I wanted to flag something, and I didn't want to do it by email." He had the direct quality she'd always appreciated. He didn't waste her time with preamble. "You're familiar with Richard Stowe," she thought. Richard Stowe was a visiting professor who'd taught an elective in corporate governance in the spring semester. She'd taken it. He'd been excellent rigorous with the specific knowledge of someone who'd worked in-house at the executive level before coming to academia. She'd found him one of the more useful teachers she'd had. "Yes," she said, "I took his governance course." "Good. He's mentioned your name. He's working on a piece for the Harvard Business Review about internal risk identification in corporate settings, case studies on instances where organizations caught integrity breaches through informal observation rather than formal audit processes." A pause. "He'd like to talk to you." Susane was still. "The Harwick situation," she said. "He's not naming sources or companies. The piece is anonymized. He's looking for the process story, how someone notices something, what they do with it, how organizations should think about that kind of informal intelligence." She thought about it. How does he know about it? "He has contacts in corporate law in Boston," Whitfield said. "Word travels in those circles, as I think you may have discovered." She thought about what Priya had said people want to know who noticed it. "What would the conversation look like?" she asked. "Coffee. Off the record until you agree otherwise. He's not going to push you to go on record. This is for his own understanding. If you're comfortable eventually being a case study, that's a separate conversation." She thought about it for another moment. "I'd need to clear it with Brown Tech's legal team." "Of course," Whitfield said. "That's the right call. I'll talk to Margaret Cole," she said. "If she's okay with it, I'll reach out to Stowe directly." "Good. Let me give you his contact." She wrote it down. She hung up and stood in the corridor for a moment. She thought about Richard Stowe and the governance course. She thought about how he'd taught the case studies not as morality tales, but as process analyses. What structures allow ethical behavior? What structures allow the opposite? She thought about what she'd done, and whether it was a case study or just a thing she'd done, and whether there was a useful difference. She went to find Margaret Cole. Margaret listened, asked 2 questions, and said, "Off-the-record conversation with no company or individual names I have no issue with. Before anything goes to print, I want to see it." "That's what I'd want too," Susane said. She sent Stowe an email that afternoon. She did not know yet what role the governance professor was going to play in the story. She would find out. The call with Stowe happened the following Tuesday morning over the phone while she was sitting on a bench outside the office building in the early July warmth with a cup of coffee. He was exactly as he had been in the classroom. Direct, intellectually precise. Genuinely curious in the specific way of someone who found the problem more interesting than the answer. He asked her to walk him through the process, not the company, not the people, but the decision-making sequence. What she'd noticed first. What she'd done with it. When she'd decided to act. When she'd decided to wait. She told him, carefully in anonymized form with the precision she'd used when writing the log. "The waiting piece is interesting," he said. "Most people get it wrong in one direction or the other. They act too fast on insufficient information, or they hold it too long out of institutional loyalty." "I was aware of both risks," she said. "What made you time it correctly?" She thought about it. "I asked myself what a wrongly timed action would cost versus a correctly timed one," she said. "Acting too early with insufficient evidence, the cost falls on me. Acting too late, the cost falls on the institution." That asymmetry clarified it. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a useful frame," he said. "I haven't heard it described that way before." "It might be a rationalization," she said. "I'm aware of that. What would make it a rationalization if I held it longer than the evidence warranted because I was uncomfortable with the institutional stakes? Was that what you were doing?" She thought about week 5. "Maybe for a few days," she said. "Then I went back to the evidence." "That's honest," he said. They talked for 45 minutes. He thanked her and said he'd be in touch if the piece moved toward publication. She went back inside and to her desk. She thought about what she'd said: acting too early cost falls on me. Acting too late cost falls on the institution. She thought about where that asymmetry appeared in other contexts. She thought about the offer. She thought about June and August and what came after. She thought about the soft kiss and the not nothing and the 6 weeks remaining on her internship.
She thought about asymmetry.
Then she thought about the cap table question and she called the San Francisco company and asked for it. The way they responded told her most of what she needed to know. The piece came out on a Wednesday in the last week of July. It was not in the Harvard Business Review, which would have taken months. It was in a business and technology publication with a national readership, a less academic venue, but a more immediate one, and it was not anonymized in the way she'd been promised it would be. She found out from Priya at 7 in the morning via text. "Have you seen this?" And then a link. She was on the train to work. She clicked the link and read the article on the small screen with the particular compression of someone absorbing bad information in a public space. The piece was Richard Stowe's, and the main thrust of it was the one he described: internal risk identification, informal observation, institutional structures that either allow or suppress ethical action. In that sense, it was what he'd said it would be. The case study was also what he'd said it would be technically. No company name, no individual names. The person who'd noticed the irregularities was referred to as an intern at a major Boston technology firm. The problem was what surrounded the case study. Stowe had written in the framing of his academic argument about the dynamics between young professionals and senior leadership in situations of institutional risk. And in that framing, he'd noted that the intern's access to senior decision-making, which proved crucial to the successful resolution of the case, was facilitated by an unusually close professional relationship with the firm's CEO. That was the sentence. She read it twice. It was accurate in the technical sense. The relationship had been close in the professional sense, and the access had been real, and all of it had been material to the outcome. But what the sentence communicated in the context of an intern and a CEO and a business publication with a national readership was not the technical accuracy. What it communicated was implication. She got off at the Seaport stop and walked to the office and read the rest of the article standing on Congress Street. Stowe had not named Brown Tech. He had not named Julian. He had not named her. But the Boston technology firm detail and the contract leak detail in a market where that information had already been circulating in legal and consulting circles were going to narrow it down. She went inside. By 9:30, it had been narrowed down. She didn't know how word of mouth, someone who connected the industry dots, someone who'd heard her name in connection with the Harwick situation through the consulting firm network Priya had mentioned. She didn't know the specific mechanism. She knew the effect. The first tweet appeared at 9:47. She knew the time because Karen came to her desk with her phone at 9:48 and said, "Something's moving on social media. I want you to be aware." Karen showed her the tweet. It did not name her, but it named Brown Tech, and it named an intern, and it had the particular quality of content posted by someone who had more information than the article contained and was deploying it strategically.
"Julian's aware," Karen said. "Legal is aware. Don't engage with anything online." "I'm not going to engage," Susane said.
"Good." Karen looked at her. "This is not your fault."
"I know," Susane said. She wasn't sure she entirely believed it yet, but she held it.
By noon, there were 14 tweets a thread on a business subreddit and a brief item on a local news site that referred to sources familiar with the situation and did not name anyone but connected the Brown Tech contract situation to questions about the firm's internal culture and the CEO's management relationships. She read every piece of it and then she stopped reading. Margaret Cole called her at 12:15.
"I'm sorry," Margaret said, and said it first before anything else. "Stowe's piece was not what he represented to me it would be."
"I know," Susane said. "We're going to address it formally," Margaret said. "Julian will be making a statement. It will be factual and it won't add fuel." "What do you want me to do?"
"Nothing that you wouldn't normally do," Margaret said. "Keep working. Don't engage online. If anyone journalists industry contacts anyone, reaches out for comment, refer them to the company's communications team, and then tell me immediately."
"Okay," Susane said.
"You did the right thing, Susane, throughout this entire situation. I want that on record."
"Thank you," she said. She hung up and sat at her desk and thought about the sentence: an unusually close professional relationship with the firm's CEO. She thought about what the next person to read that sentence would do with it, and the person after that, and what she could not control in any of it. She thought about Karen's face when she'd brought the phone over. She thought about all the people on the floor who had watched her walk into the Stellar Path sessions. She thought about what the perception looked like before this and what it looked like now. Then she opened her work files and started on the competitive mapping revisions. She was not going to be useful to anyone, including herself, by sitting with the sick feeling instead of working. Julian's statement went out at 2 o'clock that afternoon. She read it through the communications team email. It was 7 sentences. It confirmed that Brown Tech had identified and addressed an internal compliance issue. It said that the matter had been handled appropriately. It said that the Brown Tech team included exceptional people at all levels, including its internship program, who demonstrated the kind of integrity and judgment the company valued. It expressed disappointment in coverage that had characterized a professional relationship inaccurately. It did not name her, and it did not name Harwick, and it did not confirm or deny any of the specific details in the online discussion. It was exactly right. She read it twice and understood not for the first time that being good at something over many years produced a specific kind of judgment that could not be replicated by intelligence alone. She also understood that the statement was going to do some good and not enough good, because statements were reactive by definition, and the content of a narrative was established before it was corrected. She sent him a text. I read the statement. Thank you. His reply. 6 minutes later. Are you okay? She thought about it, then working through it. His reply. That's the right answer. She smiled brief and private at her phone. Then she put it down and kept working. The social media cycle had the character of all social media cycles, intense for 48 hours, with a long plateau of lower-grade discussion that she ignored because there was nothing useful to be done with it. She did not engage. She did not look at her personal social accounts for 3 days, which was easier than she'd expected, because she'd never found much of value in them during ordinary times. What she had not expected was Richard Stowe. He called her on the Thursday morning, 2 days after the piece went out. She let it go to voicemail. He left a message. I want to apologize. Call me when you can. She sat with the voicemail for a day. Then she called him back. He answered on the second ring. Thank you for calling, he said. I'm listening, she said. He apologized, directly without qualifying it as fully as she'd expected. The framing he'd included the sentence about the relationship he'd made, a judgment call he now understood was wrong, both analytically and in terms of its impact. He had prioritized his academic argument over the practical effect of the language he'd chosen. He was sorry. She listened. She didn't fill the pauses. When he was done, she said, I accepted the conversation in good faith. I trusted that the framing would be what you described. I know, he said. I cleared it with the company's legal team based on those representations. I know that too. She was quiet for a moment. What do you want from this conversation? Nothing you're not willing to give, he said. I wanted to apologize directly. I'm also, and this is separate from the apology, so feel free to disregard it, available to clarify publicly. A correction, a follow-up piece, a letter to the editor, whatever would be useful. She thought about that. I need to talk to the company's communications team before I have a view on that. Of course, he said. That's the right call. I appreciate the apology, she said. It doesn't resolve everything, but I appreciate it. I understand, he said. She hung up. She forwarded the key points of the conversation to Margaret Cole by email and then sat at her desk for a while. She thought about forgiveness and about the difference between forgiving something and not being damaged by it, which were not the same thing and which she'd always known abstractly but was now learning concretely. She thought about whether she'd been naive to trust Stowe's representation. She thought about the due diligence she'd done. She'd cleared it with legal. She'd been specific about the anonymization conditions. She'd been careful. She'd made a reasonable judgment on reasonable information. The judgment had turned out to be wrong. That was not the same as having made the wrong judgment. It was a distinction she needed. The internship board conversation happened on a Friday. She did not know it had happened until Monday, when Karen came to her desk again with the different expression, the one she reserved for things that needed to be said carefully. The board has concerns, Karen said. She sat in the side chair. About the internship program and the media situation. They've asked Julian to address the perception question directly. Susane was very still. What does addressing it look like? I don't know yet, Karen said. Julian is meeting with them this week. He'll have more afterward. What are the possible outcomes? Karen looked at her steadily. One possibility is that he asks you to end the internship early, for optics. She held that. The other possibility is that he pushes back on the board and manages it through the official statement. Which is more likely? I don't know, Karen said. I wanted you to have the information. After Karen left, she sat at her desk and thought about the $47 million and the exclusivity clause and the competitive mapping, and the 3 years at Carmine's and the scholarship committee's supplemental financial disclosure. She thought about the sum of the things she'd built, and what it looked like from outside, and what it looked like from inside, and how the inside view was the accurate one, and how the inside view was precisely what no one could see. She thought about Julian in the board meeting. She picked up her phone and called Priya. "I need to talk," she said. "I'm in a meeting in 20, Priya said. "I can call at lunch." "Lunch is fine," Susane said. She hung up and kept working. By the time Priya called at 12:15, she'd already mostly decided. "Talk me through it," Priya said. She laid it out: the media cycle, the board, the 2 possible outcomes, what it meant for the offer, and what it meant for the internship. "What are you thinking?" Priya asked. "I'm thinking about whether I should resign before it becomes a forced question." Priya was quiet for a moment. "Walk me through the reasoning." "If I stay and the board pushes Julian to end it, it ends anyway. And it ends in a way that takes the decision out of both of our hands and creates a specific narrative about why it ended. If I resign preemptively, the narrative is that I chose to leave. That's cleaner. For who? For Julian, for the company." A pause. "For what I want my professional reputation to be." "And for you?" She was quiet. "That's what I thought," Priya said. "The reasoning is right up until the last piece. You're making a decision to protect other people without knowing what they need to be protected from. I know what the board is concerned about." "You know what Karen said the board is concerned about," Priya said. "You don't know what Julian's going to do about it. You haven't asked him." She thought about this. "Have you talked to him about this?" Priya asked. "No." "Then you don't have all the information you'd need to make this decision correctly," Priya said. "And you're a person who waits until she has the information." Susane looked at her ceiling. "That's a fairly targeted observation." "You're welcome," Priya said. "Also, and I say this as someone who loves you and has also watched you make this exact error before, you are not responsible for every consequence of a situation you did not create." "I did create part of it." "You reported a leak that was causing real damage to a company. You did not create Richard Stowe's sentence structure." "I trusted him. In good faith. That's different." Priya's voice was even. "Talk to Julian before you decide anything." She said she would. She didn't do it that day. She thought about what Priya had said, and she thought about the decision calculus she'd laid out to Stowe: cost falls on me versus cost falls on the institution. She thought about what it meant to resign quietly, who it was actually protecting, and whether protection was the right goal. She thought about what Julian had said the night of the kiss, the night in the conference room, when the context had been entirely different. "I'm not going to tell you what to do with the offer. That can't be part of this." She went home on Friday evening without having said anything. She did not sleep well. On Saturday morning, she drafted a resignation letter. She looked at it for 20 minutes and then deleted it. On Sunday, she took a walk through the South End and thought about Greenfield and about the quality of patience that looked like accumulation and was actually decision deferred. She thought about the difference between waiting until you had the information and waiting because you were afraid of the information. On Sunday afternoon, she sent Julian a text. "Can I come by, not the office?" His reply came in 15 minutes, yes. "When?" She typed hour. His reply: "I'll send you the address."
Yeah.
He lived in the South End, which she had not known, and which was in retrospect consistent with what she did know, a neighborhood that was neither ostentatious nor particularly visible, close to work, close to the harbor, walkable. The building was a converted brownstone on a narrow street. He buzzed her up without comment. He opened the door in the civilian version of himself. No suit, jacket, dark pants, and a collarless shirt. The particular at-home quality of a person who spent most of his time being professional and had learned to be genuinely different in private spaces. "Come in," he said. The apartment was not what she'd expected, and exactly what she'd expected. Large rooms, not decorated impressively, but comfortably books on the shelves that had been read, a kitchen that showed signs of actual use. The view was of the street and a small courtyard garden below. She could see the corner of the harbor in the distance. She sat on the couch. He sat across from her. He didn't offer coffee or food or anything that would have been a displacement of the conversation, which she noticed and appreciated. "I've been thinking about resigning," she said. He held that without reacting. "Walk me through it," he said, the same phrase Priya had used. She did. The reasoning, the board, the narrative, the cost structure. She laid it out the way she laid out everything, clearly, without drama, in the order that made logical sense. He listened the way he always listened, completely. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "The board met on Thursday," he said.
I told them the characterization in the press was inaccurate. I told them that the work you've done has produced measurable value for the company. I told them that the appropriate response to inaccurate media coverage is not to validate it by making decisions that make it look accurate. She was still.
I pushed back, he said. The board heard it. It's not fully resolved, but the direction of the conversation is toward letting the internship conclude normally. You pushed back onto the board, she said. It wasn't a hard call, he said. The situation doesn't warrant the response they were considering. She thought about that. They're going to keep having concerns, she said. Even if the internship ends normally. If the offer comes through and I take it, the offer will come through, he said. What you do with it is yours. Julian. She said his name the way she'd started to say it, not carefully, just actually. What happens to you if I take it from the board's perspective? He looked at her steadily. That's a real question, he said. I know it is. The honest answer is that there's some risk, he said, less than you're imagining. The board's primary concern is about perception rather than substance. Substance in this case is clearly appropriate. He paused. But I'm not going to lie to you and tell you there's no cost. Then tell me the cost. Some continued scrutiny, he said. Some ongoing noise? A conversation I'll need to have with the board after you join permanently, if you join permanently, about what the relationship is and what it isn't. He said it plainly. Those are manageable things. They don't change the decision about the offer. They should factor into my decision about the offer, she said. Yes, he said. They should. And that's your call, not mine. She looked at him. I came here to tell you I was considering resigning. I thought I don't know what I thought. That it would be easier. Easier for who? For you, she said. For the company. She looked at the window. I was going to make the decision that reduced the cost to other people. And then Priya told me I was making it without enough information. Priya's right, he said. I know. She looked back at him. Running away won't protect either of us, will it? He held her gaze. There was something in his expression she had not seen before, less controlled than usual and more visible for it. No, he said. It won't. They sat with that for a moment in the Sunday afternoon quiet. She thought about everything that had led here. The bar at Carmine's and the wrong first impression and the application in the interview room and not yet in week 7. The log and the kiss and the cap table and the sentence in Stowe's article that had made her feel for the first time in the internship genuinely uncertain about the ground under her. She thought about all the ways she'd been right and all the ways she'd been wrong and how both of those things were part of the same person. I need to ask you something, she said. Go ahead. At Carmine's, she said, the night before the interview, did you know I was going to be in the interview room? He was quiet for a moment. Dana pulled your file the morning of the interview, he said. I saw the name. I knew. Why didn't you say anything? Because you'd formed an impression that you were entitled to revise on your own terms, he said. And because I wanted to know if the interview was strong enough to stand on its own. Was it? You told me the board was optimizing for announcement value, he said, in the first interview about the board's own acquisition decision. I was nervous, she said. That's what I'm like when I'm nervous. I know, he said. That's why it was a good interview. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her. The afternoon light was making the room warm coming through the windows at the angle particular to Sunday afternoons in July. I'm not going to resign, she said. Something shifted in his face. Not relief exactly, more like a weight settling correctly. Good, he said. I'm going to finish the internship, she said, and I'm going to make the decision about the offer based on the work and what I want and not based on what I think will be easier for anyone else. That's the right decision, he said. And if I take the offer, she said, we're going to have to figure out what this is. She meant the not nothing and the soft kiss and the Sunday afternoon and everything that had been accumulating since March. On terms that are real, not protected by the internship timeline. I know, he said. I don't know if I can do that yet, she said. I want to be honest about that. You've been honest about everything, he said. That's not new. She stood to go. He stood too. They were standing across the room from each other in the South End apartment on a Sunday afternoon, and she thought about everything she'd decided in the past 2 hours, and everything that remained undecided, and she thought that both of those things were exactly the right size. I'll see you Monday, she said. Monday, he said. She went to the door. He held it open for her. On the threshold, she stopped and looked at him once more, the at-home version of him, the brownstone building, the Sunday afternoon without a suit jacket. Thank you, she said, for the board meeting.
You earned it, he said. Every piece of it.
She walked down the stairs and out into the south end. The street was doing its Sunday thing, dog walkers, someone wheeling a bicycle, the distant sound of a restaurant kitchen. She walked for a while without thinking about where she was going, just moving in the summer afternoon, and then she found herself at the edge of a small park, and she sat on a bench and looked at the trees. She thought about running away and what it had looked like when she'd almost done it. She thought about the decision calculus she'd laid out to Stowe and how she'd applied it wrong. She'd been so focused on the institutional cost that she'd obscured the personal one. The personal cost of leaving would have been real and not small, and she'd been prepared to pay it without acknowledging that she was paying it. She thought about what it meant to learn patience not as a value, but as a skill. She thought about October and the fall semester and what came after that. She sat on the bench until the afternoon light shifted. Then she got up and went home. The final 2 weeks of the internship had a particular texture, the compression of something ending that you know is not really ending. The Stellar Path renewal closed formally on the second Thursday of August. The terms were good, better than the preliminary framework, better than the position they'd been in during the Harwick period, reflecting the negotiating room she'd identified in the competitive analysis. Karen told her the final figures in the flat way she reported everything. The number was meaningful. She went to the signing meeting as an observer. She sat at the back of the conference room and watched Julian across the table from Stellar Path's procurement team, and she watched the way he operated in a high-stakes negotiation patient, precise with the specific quality of someone who had all the information and knew which pieces to reveal in what sequence. It was, she thought, a kind of mastery, not performance. Mastery. Afterward, in the corridor, he passed her and said, "Good outcome." "Good outcome," she agreed. The Stellar Path rep walking past said something to Julian that she didn't catch, and Julian said something brief in response. She thought about all the professional interactions he had in a day, all the people who needed something from him, all the relationships that were transactional in the correct and appropriate sense. She thought about the sentence she kept returning to, "I'm not going to tell you what to do with the offer. That can't be part of this." She was still deciding. She was being careful. She had 4 weeks before the Harvard fall semester, and she was using them. On her last day, there was a small team gathering, not a party, nothing formal, just the strategic development group in the kitchen at 4 in the afternoon, with coffee and the pastries Karen had brought, and the specific awkwardness of a work farewell done by people who weren't sure how effusive to be. Raphael gave her a handshake and said, with the directness he'd developed over the summer, "You made me better at this," which was more than she'd expected from him. The 2 Wharton interns were gracious. Karen said, "Come back," which from Karen was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Julian appeared at 4:30. He'd clearly come from a meeting still in his jacket, something slightly more focused in his face than the end of day usually produced. He stood at the edge of the gathered group and said a few words to Raphael, and then to the Wharton interns, and then he came to stand near her. "Last day," he said. "Last day," she said. He was holding a coffee mug that was empty. He turned it in his hands the way he did. "How does it feel?" "Different from what I expected," she said. "Better." "What did you expect?" She thought about the interview about standing on Congress Street in March with her portfolio. "I expected to learn something about how companies work," she said. "I learned something about how thinking works." He looked at her. "That's the better thing." "Yes," she said. They stood in the kitchen with the background sound of the group around them. She thought about everything she wasn't going to say in a company kitchen on a Friday afternoon with her colleagues present. He thought about it too, she could tell. He had a specific quality when he was being careful. A slight additional stillness, the absence of the pen turning. "I'll be in touch," he said. It was a sentence that meant several things. "I know," she said. She left at 5. She took the elevator down and walked out through the lobby and handed in her ID badge. She stood on Congress Street for a moment, the same spot she'd stood in March, but different now in every way that mattered. The harbor was ahead of her. A ferry was crossing the same as always. She started walking. The fall semester had its own gravity, and she let it pull her. She had 2 required courses and a research elective she'd chosen for the specific professor rather than the subject, and she had Priya, who had returned from the Back Bay gig and resumed their Tuesday night Thai restaurant dinners as if the summer had not intervened in anything material. She had the 3 offers on the table, which she kept returning to in the specific way she returned to things she hadn't decided, not obsessively, but regularly, the way you keep checking a window where something is happening. She and Julian texted. Not often, 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes more when a specific thing came up, and the specific things were not always work adjacent. He sent her a link to an article about organizational learning that she read and had thoughts about and sent back. She sent him something about the San Francisco company, which had indeed required a bridge round the cap table, having told her exactly what it was going to tell her. He replied, called it, which was 3 syllables of validation and nothing more. He called once on a Thursday evening in September about something specific. He had a board presentation in October about strategic planning, and he wanted to think through the competitive landscape with someone. And then he paused and said, "Is this appropriate?" She thought about it. "Probably," she said. "In the sense that matters." "In the sense that matters," he repeated. "We're not in the same building anymore," she said. "You're not my employer." "For now," he said. "For now?" she agreed. They talked for 40 minutes about the competitive landscape, and it was the same as the late sessions had been good and direct and mutually useful, and underneath that something that was not work and had not been work for a long time. She thought about what came next. She did not rush it. She was learning patience as a skill. The night in October when she called him, it was because she'd decided. Not about the offer she'd decided that weeks ago in a way she understood but hadn't fully acknowledged. About the other thing. The not nothing and the Sunday afternoon and everything she'd been carrying since August, with the care of someone who knew the carrying would eventually require a next step. She called him at 8:30 on a Thursday. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey." "Hey," she said. "Are you busy?" "No," he said, which might or might not have been accurate, but was the right answer. "I've decided about the offer," she said. A pause. "Tell me," he said. "I'm taking it," she said. "Not because of you. I want to be clear about that." "I know," he said. "Because the work is the work I want to do," she said. "In the environment where I think I learn the most. And because San Francisco told me a lot about their cap table by how they responded to the question, and New York is a good option, but it's not the right option for this particular stage." "Those are good reasons," he said. "Yes," she said. "They are." She was sitting in her dorm room with the window open to the October night. "And I need to tell you something else." He waited. "I've been thinking about the not nothing," she said, "since August. I haven't said anything because I needed to think about it separately from the offer decision. They had to be separate decisions or they'd contaminate each other." "I understand that," he said. "I also needed to not be your intern when I said it," she said, "for it to mean what it means." "Susane," he said. "Let me finish," she said. He was quiet. "I've spent this semester thinking about what I misread and what I read correctly and where the difference is," she said. "I read you wrong at Carmine's. I was right about the analysis on the stellar path risk. I was wrong about resigning. I read the cap table right. The pattern isn't that I'm right or that I'm wrong. It's that I'm right when I give myself the time and the information." She paused. "I've had 4 months. I have the information." "What does it tell you?" he said. His voice was quiet and fully present in the way that she'd been listening to all year. "That this is real," she said. "That it was real in the office and it's real now. And that I want to see what it is when it's not complicated by everything else." He was quiet for a moment. She listened to the silence the way she'd learned to listen to his silences, as information rather than absence. "I've been thinking about the same thing," he said. "I know you have," she said. "Since March," he said. "Me too," she said. Outside the dorm window, the October wind was doing something to the trees on the quad. She could hear it distantly, the specific sound of fall arriving in Cambridge. "Caw! Can I take you to dinner?" he said. "Not at Carmine's." She smiled. "Why not Carmine's?" "Because I'd like to have this particular conversation somewhere that isn't where you used to bring me the check," he said. She laughed. Actually laughed with the particular pleasure of something landing exactly where it was supposed to. "Fair," she said. They made a plan. She hung up and sat with the October night coming through the window and felt for the first time in a long time the particular kind of lightness that comes when a thing you've been carrying very carefully has been set down properly. She turned back to her textbook. She had a case analysis due. The lightness stayed. She did not hear from Richard Stowe again. She heard from Professor Whitfield that he'd published a clarification in the same outlet that had run the original piece, not a retraction, but a clarification that specified the professional nature of the relationship referenced in the case study. It was the thing Stowe had offered. and the thing the communications team had decided was useful. She didn't know if it fully repaired anything. She knew it was something. She thought about forgiveness, and the difference between it and moving on, which were often mistaken for each other. She thought about Harwick's text you reported me. I know. She thought about the fact that she'd done the right thing, and that the right thing had been messy, and that this was, she suspected, always how the right thing went. She was going to take that into the job. She was going to take a lot of things into the job that she hadn't had when she'd walked into the interview room in March. The semester moved. October became November. The case analysis got done. The offer letter from Brown Tech arrived in her university email with the formal salary figure and the start date and the title business strategist. Not intern. A different thing.
She read it twice. She thought about Karen's flat tone saying good work, and Julian at the head of the conference table and the stellar path figure, and the exclusivity clause, and the competitive mapping with the third quadrant problem.
She thought about the analytics folder in the shared drive and the spring analysis that had solved the problem. She accepted the offer. She sent Julian a text, signed. His reply 3 minutes later. Congratulations, strategist. She smiled at her phone. She was ready. She graduated on a Saturday in May that had the specific quality of New England spring days that had earned their warmth, not the tentative warmth of March, not the already committed warmth of June, but the real thing arrived after enough cold to make it meaningful. Her mother drove up from Greenfield. She arrived at 7 in the morning, which was her mother's way, always early, always slightly anxious about parking, always carrying food that wasn't needed. She brought a thermos of coffee and 2 turkey sandwiches that they ate, sitting in the folding chairs outside Cabot House before the ceremony. Her mother in her good blue dress and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, talking about the drive and the construction on Route 2 and how the magnolias looked beautiful. Susane listened to her mother talk about the magnolias and felt with the particular clarity that significant moments sometimes carry what it meant to be here. Not the abstract meaning, the career, the credential, the future that was now technically beginning. The specific physical meaning of the day. The blue dress, the turkey sandwiches, the magnolias, the mother who had worked hospital shifts for 20 years and driven through the Route 2 construction to see this. You look good, her mother said. You're biased, Susane said. That doesn't make it wrong, her mother said. They walked to the ceremony.
Hey.
Priya found her afterward in the post-ceremony chaos of the yard, the particular organized pandemonium of several thousand people trying to locate each other, simultaneously photographs being taken in front of every building. The sound of it all. She came through the crowd in her graduation regalia with the expression of someone who'd had a good morning and knew it. We did it, Priya said.
You did it in December, Susane said.
Priya had finished her MBA in the fall semester, which was the superior move logistically, and had made Priya insufferably rational about it for the subsequent months.
I'm here in support, Priya said. She looked at Susane's mother. You raised an excellent person. She made me better at work, and also at being a person. Her mother looked at Priya and then at Susane. I like her, she said, as if Priya weren't standing directly in front of her. She's always done that, Susane said.
They found a spot in the sun and stood in the way of several photographs and didn't care.
Matu.
Julian had asked how the day was by text the night before. She told him it was good. He'd said, it'll be better than good. She thought about that and thought he was probably right. He had offered once to come. She had said it's a family day, and she'd meant it with precision, not excluding him but correctly locating what the day was for. He had understood. He understood most things she said precisely, and the things he didn't understand he asked about, which was its own form of the same quality. They'd had dinner in October as planned at a quiet Italian restaurant in the Back Bay that she'd liked for its atmosphere of slightly worn elegance, not trying too hard, just good in the way of things that had been doing their job for a long time. They'd talked for 3 hours, not about work, about other things, or about work only in the oblique way it appeared when you talked about anything you cared about. He told her about a trip he'd taken to Japan in his 30s before the company when he'd been working for someone else's enterprise and had gone alone and had spent 2 weeks doing something that defied the planning instinct he'd been cultivating and just moved through the country on its own logic. She'd told him about the summer she was 14 when she'd decided she was going to understand how money worked, really worked. Not the way it was explained in high school, but the actual mechanics. And she'd spent the summer reading library books about it, and had come out the other side with a functional understanding of compound interest and a conviction that she was going to have options. He'd looked at her when she said that. 14, he said. My grandmother had just told me there was no money for college, she said. I decided she was wrong.
Was she?
She was working with the information she had, Susane said, which didn't include scholarships. He nodded once. He understood the specific dignity of that kind of story. The Greenfield and Worcester version, the kind that didn't need to be made larger than it was. After dinner, they'd walked for a while in the back bay. Evening, the November air cold enough to require her coat, and he'd put his hand in hers, not with any particular drama, but in the way of something that had found the right moment. She'd let it stay. They'd walked a few blocks, and then she'd said she was taking the tea, and he'd said he'd walk her to the stop. On the platform, he'd said, "Is this what you want it to be?" She'd thought about that. She'd been thinking about it for months. "Yes," she said. "I think so." "I think so too," he said. And that had been that in the understated way of people who communicated in compression.
But
Between October and May, she'd finished her degree, and he'd finished a board presentation cycle, and Stellar Path had renewed successfully with the revised terms, and the board situation had settled into the background of other things to manage. She'd met his colleagues twice in contexts that required no explanation, once at a Brown Tech event she attended as a former intern, once at an industry dinner, and both times the interactions had been professionally unremarkable, which was precisely what they were supposed to be. She met 3 of his friends in December at a dinner he'd hosted at the South End apartment that was less a formal introduction and more an evening that had happened to include her. The 3 of them were men he'd known for 20 years, a lawyer, an architect, a former colleague who'd gone on to run his own firm. They were his age or close to it, and they treated her the way she understood was the right test, not as a presence that required explaining. Not with the particular edge of curiosity that would have meant they'd already been discussing it, but as a person at a dinner table who was there because she was there. Afterward, walking home through the December streets, he'd said, "They liked you." "That's not a very interesting judgment," she said.
no.
"Interesting would be if they'd had more complex reactions," she said. "The fact that they liked me just means I was okay at dinner." He looked at her. "You're very hard to compliment." "I'm not," she said. "I just don't treat social approval as an outcome." "What do you treat as an outcome?" She thought about it. Whether the thing was real. Was it real? She thought about the dinner, the conversation that had moved between several subjects without any of them being forced, the specific warmth of people who'd known each other long enough not to perform the way she'd found herself genuinely interested in what the architect was saying about adaptive reuse of industrial buildings.
Yes, she said, it was.
He'd taken her hand again in the December street, in the same quiet way.
Just for Mom.
She started at Brown Tech on the second Tuesday in June, which was almost exactly a year after her first day as an intern. The lobby felt different and the same. She handed the reception desk her new ID badge, a different badge from the visitor pass permanent with her photograph and her title. Business strategist. She took the elevator to the 11th floor and went to her desk, which was not a different desk from the one she'd had as an intern, but was now unambiguously hers. Karen came by at 9. "Good to have you back," she said, in the flat tone that meant it. "Good to be here," Susane said, and meant it. The Tuesday meeting was at 10. She sat at the table, not at the back where the intern sat, midway in the working section, because that was where she belonged now. Julian ran the meeting the way he always ran the meeting. He called on her once about a piece of analysis she'd submitted the previous week. She answered. He incorporated it. The meeting moved on. Afterward, in the hallway, he caught her eye briefly. Just a look, just a second, with the slight warmth of something between them that was real and private and not performed for anyone. She went back to her desk. She opened her files. She got to work.
Done.
The relationship became public the way organic things become public, not through announcement, but through accumulation of ordinary evidence. She and Julian had dinner on Thursday evening, sometimes at his place, and sometimes at hers, and sometimes at restaurants they'd found on the principle of good but not trying. They were visible together in the neighborhoods they moved through, the South End, the waterfront, the area around Fenway, on the nights when the stadium filled the air with something particular. They were not hiding. They were not announcing. At Brown Tech, the news spread in the quiet way of things people have observed and then confirmed. She knew it had spread because the way people talked to her shifted slightly. Not worse, not patronizing, but acknowledging something that had now been named. She'd thought about how she'd handle this, and she had one answer, which was to be exactly as competent and available and precise as she'd been as an intern, and to let that be the whole of the answer. She couldn't control the perception. She could control the work. Karen. The third week said, "There'll be a period where some people will be watching."
I know, Susane said.
"You know what to do about it."
Work, Susane said.
"That's it," Karen said. She worked. She was very good at it. Within 2 months, the watching had settled into something else. The particular ambient awareness of a workplace that had absorbed a fact about itself and moved on. She heard through Raphael, who had returned as a full-time hire, and who had a talent for organizational weather, that most people's reaction had shifted from curiosity to something more like acceptance. People saw how it developed, Raphael said with the directness he'd been developing since the orientation. "That makes a difference." "What did they see?" she asked. "That it wasn't the impression thing," he said. "That you were doing the work first." He paused. "Also, that he doesn't act differently around you than he acts around anyone else. That matters to people." She thought about that. It was accurate. He was the same in meetings, the same in the hallway, the same in the kitchen. The precision of his attention was the same when it landed on her as when it landed on anyone. What was different was what she carried out of the room afterward, and that was private as it should be. In August, she was assigned to lead a project, not as support, not as analysis, but as lead. A partnership evaluation that had stalled something in the manufacturing sector, a company that made logistics software for industrial applications, and that Brown Tech was considering acquiring. Karen briefed her on it and then said, "It's yours. You have 3 weeks." She spent the 3 weeks on it the way she spent most things, comprehensively, precisely with the log habit she'd developed as an intern, now applied to a project rather than a surveillance exercise. She built the analysis, she ran the evaluation, she talked to the right people in the right order, and at the end of 3 weeks, she had a recommendation with a confidence interval and a clear methodology and an error analysis. She presented it to the strategic development group on a Thursday morning. Julian was in the room. He sat where he always sat. He listened the way he always listened. She didn't look at him while she presented. She looked at the room, at Karen, at the other people who were evaluating the work on its merits. She made the case. She answered the questions. She fielded the pushback from the operations director without yielding on the core analysis. At the end, Julian said, "Questions, comments." Silence. "The methodology is sound," he said in the flat professional register. "The confidence interval is appropriately conservative. The recommendation is clear." He looked at the room. "Good work." She went back to her desk. She felt the specific satisfaction of something built correctly. Not because he'd said good work, though, that was not nothing, and she knew it, but because the room had seen it and received it on its own terms. That was what she'd come for. They had a conversation about the age gap once. It was a Sunday in September at his apartment with the windows open to the early fall air and the sound of the street below. They'd been talking about something else, and it had surfaced naturally, not with drama, not with the artificial weight of a topic being finally addressed. More like a thing that came up when enough time had passed and enough ease had accumulated. "You're 23, he said. "I know how old I am," she said. "I'm 47, he said. "I know how old you are, too." He looked at the window. "There are things that will be complicated by that." "There are things that are complicated by everything," she said. "I'm not interested in the abstraction. I'm interested in the specific." "The specific is that I'm at a different stage," he said. "Things you haven't done yet, I've done. Things I'm past, you're approaching." "I know that," she said. "What are you actually worried about?" He was quiet for a moment. She'd learned his silences well enough to recognize this one, the preparatory quiet, the kind before he said something true. "That at some point you'll want something I can't give you," he said. "Not from lack of desire, from difference in stage." "What does that mean specifically?" she said. "It means you're 23 and I'm 47 and the things that are in front of you are still entirely open," he said. "And I think about that out." She looked at him. "Have I given you any reason to think I'm not here by choice?" "No," he said. "Then worry about the specific thing when it's specific," she said, "not the abstract version." "You're very pragmatic," he said. "You're very protective," she said, "of yourself." He looked at her. "I know. You've been protecting yourself for a long time," she said. "It's a good habit that's become a reflex." She said it without edge. "I'm not the woman from the bar. I'm not someone who wants something from your position." "I know that," he said. "Then what are you actually afraid of?" He was quiet again. The street sound came through the window, a car, someone's dog. the distant sound of a Sunday afternoon. "That I'll want this more than you do," he said finally. Eventually. It was the most unguarded thing she'd heard him say. She sat with it for a moment, not to collect herself, but because it deserved the weight of actual consideration. "That's a real fear," she said. "Yes. It might be true," she said. "I can't promise you it isn't. I can tell you that right now I don't know how to want this more than I do." She paused. "That's the only honest answer." He held her gaze. Something in his face released slightly, not dramatically. Not the Hollywood version of release, but the small adjustment of a person who has been braced for something for a long time and has just allowed himself not to be. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. She leaned against him on the couch in the September afternoon. He put his arm around her. They sat like that for a while without talking, with the street sounds below and the early fall air through the window. She thought about what it cost him to say the real thing. She thought about what it cost her to receive it without reflexively making it smaller. She thought that this was probably what real things required the patience to let them be what they were. She thought about learning. The diner was on a Thursday in October, which was not planned. She was in Cambridge for a work lunch that ran past 2, and afterward she was walking back toward the tea stop, and she passed Carmine's, which was different in the afternoon, the bar quiet, the dining room mostly empty, the specific mid-afternoon quiet of a restaurant between its working hours. She called him. "Where are you?" he said. "Cambridge," she said, "near Carmine's." A pause. "The bar at Carmine's," he said. "Where we met," she said. "Where you formed an erroneous impression of me," he said with the corner of the mouth quality. "Where I was working a closing shift at midnight and formed a reasonable impression on insufficient data," she said. A generous framing. "I've been generous with myself about it," she said. "It's been a process." He laughed. Not the quiet version actually laughed, which she still found slightly startling each time, because he held it back often enough that when it came, it had full weight. "I'm near there in an hour," he said. "If you want company." "I do," she said. She went inside and got a corner table and ordered coffee. She watched the room fill slightly as the afternoon moved toward evening, a couple at the far end, a man working on a laptop, the bartender restocking the rail with the particular focus of the pre-shift hour. She thought about the first night, the glamorous woman and the edge of the conversation she'd caught, and the midnight impression. She thought about the 40% tip that had irritated her without her being able to say why. She thought about the walk home in the February cold, turning over the case analysis due Thursday, not thinking about him at all. She thought about how much you could get wrong in 12 minutes. He came in at 4:30. He found her at the corner table with the ease of someone who had found her in many rooms and knew how to do it without looking like he was looking. He sat across from her. The bartender came over. He ordered coffee. "So," he said. "So," she said. He looked at the bar where he'd sat the first night. She looked at it too. "You were awful," she said. "To be clear, I was sitting at a bar," he said. "You were very composed for someone being badly wanted at midnight," she said. "I was trying to be kind," he said. "Poorly, probably." "No, actually," she said. "You were kind. That was the part I missed." She turned her coffee cup. "I read it as controlled. You were actually trying to manage a situation without making it worse." "It worked," he said. "Poorly," she said with the same word. She left without what she came for. "She came for something that wasn't available," he said. "That was always going to go the way it went." She looked at him across the corner table in the afternoon light of Carmine's, and she thought about the first time she'd looked at him from across the bar with her apron on and her wrong impression fully formed. She thought about the version of this story she'd almost written, the one where she'd been right about him, where he'd been exactly what she'd decided he was, where the internship had been, another box checked on a spreadsheet. She thought about how much narrower that would have been. "The first time I saw you," she said, "I thought you were terrible." He looked at her with the slight warmth that had been accumulating since March of the previous year. "I know," he said. "You weren't," she said. "Not entirely," he said. "Not at all," she said. "Not in the ways that matter." He was quiet for a moment. He picked up his coffee and held it without drinking it, the old familiar gesture. "What matters," he said. She thought about the long answer, everything she'd learned and revised and accumulated over the past 14 months, the log and the interview and the hallway conversations and the Sunday afternoon in the South End and the October phone call. She thought about all of it. "Whether you're the same person in private," she said. "That's the one that matters." He held her gaze. Outside, the Thursday afternoon was doing its Boston thing. A bus went past. Someone walked a dog. The harbor was 2 blocks away in the particular October light.
Are you? She said.
He thought about it. More than I used to be, he said. She smiled. That's an honest answer.
I'm working on it, he said.
So am I, she said. They sat with their coffee in the Carmine's afternoon, and it was not a fairy tale, not grand, or concluded, or wrapped in anything more beautiful than what it actually was. 2 people, a corner table. October in Cambridge, the ordinary and very specific warmth of something real. She thought about the wrong first impression, and what it had cost her, and what it had given her. She thought about the filing cabinet, and the closed conclusions, and the long revision. She thought about the 7 stages of development she hadn't been trying to track, and had tracked anyway, inevitably, because that's what it is when it's real. She thought about patience and what it looked like when it became something else. Finish your coffee, she said. I want to walk. He finished it. They left the diner together, not hurrying, not marking it as anything more than what it was, because it didn't need to be marked. The Thursday street was doing its ordinary thing. She put her hand in his, and they walked in the October afternoon away from Carmine's toward the water. And there was nothing to say that hadn't been said, and there was everything still ahead, and both of those things were exactly right. The following March, on a day that was trying hard to be spring and getting most of the way there, Susane sat in the Brown Tech conference room for the Tuesday strategy meeting and looked at the table. It was the same conference room, the same long table, the same glass wall looking over the floor, the same ambient hum of people working. Karen was to her left. Raphael was across the table. The operations director and 2 people from analytics and 3 people she'd worked with over the past 8 months were ranged around the room in the easy configuration of people who knew each other's work. Julian came in and sat at the head of the table and said, "Morning. Let's start with the competitor update." She had the competitor update. She opened her file and began. He listened in the way he always listened. He asked questions. He pushed back on one of her conclusions, specifically about a regional market share projection she'd framed as a certainty when it was more accurately a strong likelihood. She accepted the pushback and revised the framing in the document on her screen. He moved on. 40 minutes later, the meeting ended. People filed out. She was closing her laptop when he stopped at the end of the table. She was the last one in the room, which had been a pattern for a year and a half now, and was simply where she was at the end of meetings. "The certainty thing," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll watch it." "It's not a criticism," he said. "It's a calibration." "I know the difference," she said. He looked at her across the table. She looked back. The glass wall was behind him, and the office floor was behind that, and the harbor was behind all of it, the March light on the water, pale and real. "Good meeting," he said. "Good meeting," she agreed. He left. She took her laptop and her notes and walked back to her desk through the open floor where people were at their work, and she sat down and opened the competitor update file and changed the framing of the projection, and she thought about the calibration between certainty and strong likelihood, and how important that distinction was in a world where what you claimed to know had consequences. She thought about the wrong first impression and everything that had followed from revising it. She opened a new section of the document and started writing. She had work to do. Epilogue. 7 months later at a company dinner in November, the kind that happened at the end of a fiscal year, that had gone well. Not a celebration, just an acknowledgement, a dinner for the people who'd worked. Susane sat at a table with Karen and Raphael and 2 people from the analytics team, and she listened to the room. The room was full of people she knew, people whose names she knew not because she'd memorized an org chart, but because she'd worked beside them and argued with them in meetings and solved problems with them, and in a few cases watched them grow through the same year she was growing through. She knew Oliver, whose mother's progressive diagnosis had resulted in a process she didn't know the details of, but that Oliver seemed to be navigating in the way hard things are navigated, with difficulty and with support. She knew Dana, who had been with Julian for 13 years, and who treated Susane now with the specific warmth of someone who had observed a thing develop from the beginning and found it satisfactory. She knew Raphael's desk habits and Karen's tone of real approval and the way the Tuesday meetings changed texture depending on who'd had a difficult week. She'd spent a year and a half building knowledge of this place from the inside, and the inside knowledge was exactly what she'd said she wanted in the orientation meeting, how decisions actually get made as opposed to how they get described afterward. Across the table, Julian was talking to the operations director. He was in the dinner version of himself, suit jacket, white shirt, slightly more present in the way of someone who'd stopped managing the day and was just in it. She watched him laugh at something the operations director said, the real version of the laugh, not the professional acknowledgement. He caught her eye across the table. Not a long look, just a look. She turned back to the conversation she was in, which was Karen describing with characteristic brevity the competitive mapping project she was going to hand off to Susane in January. It's a big one, Karen said. I like the big ones, Susane said. I know you do, Karen said. That's why I'm giving it to you. She thought about this competitive mapping she'd done as an intern, the third quadrant problem, the spring analytics data. She thought about how different the work was now and how the same the method was. Find the real question, build the frame carefully. Don't close around an answer until you have to. She thought about all the things she'd been right about and all the things she'd revised. She thought about the specific and ongoing project of being a person who tried to get it right. She looked at the November room full of people doing their work. She understood exactly where she was supposed to be. Not in the fairy tale sense, not in the sense of destiny or magic or the universe arranging itself. In the ordinary and earned sense. The sense of you made 100 decisions that brought you here, and some of them were wrong, and you revised, and the sum of all of it is this room, this table, this work, this life. That was enough. That was actually everything. She turned back to Karen and said, "Tell me about the project," Karen told her. She listened. End. There was a moment sometime in December when she understood what she was learning that she hadn't expected to learn. She was on the phone with her mother, a Sunday call the usual, and her mother was asking about the job in the way she always asked about the job, which was practical. Was she being paid fairly? Were the people reasonable? Was the work something she could still want in 5 years? Her mother was a practical woman who had been made more practical by the specific pressures of her life, and she asked practical questions because those were the ones with answers. Susane was answering them, yes, yes, mostly. Yes, yes. And she was looking out the window of her own apartment, which she'd found in August, a one-bedroom in the South End that was not close to Julian's building by design, and that had the specific quality of a space that was hers. She'd furnished it deliberately, a piece at a time, the way she did most things, and it had its own logic now. It felt like somewhere she lived. "You sound good," her mother said. "I am good," Susane said. A pause on the line. "The man," her mother said. She'd been told about the man in October in the way Susane told her mother about significant things directly without excessive prelude. "He's good too," Susane said. "He's older," her mother said. 24 years, Susane said. "That's a lot of years." "It's a lot of years," she agreed. "It's also not the relevant variable." Her mother was quiet for a moment. What is the relevant variable? She thought about it. "Whether he's the same person in private," she said. Her mother was quiet again, the thinking kind of quiet. "And is he—" "More than most people," she said. "More than most people," her mother repeated, as if trying it on. "Then, is that enough?" She looked at her apartment. She thought about the October dinner and the November dinner and the Sunday afternoons and the Tuesday meetings and the conversation about the fear that I'll want this more than you do, and how he'd said it in the unguarded way, and how she'd received it without making it smaller. "It's more than most people get," she said. Her mother thought about this for a longer time than Susane had expected. Then she said, "Your father was a practical man. I loved him for it. Practical was the right thing then." Susane held the phone. "That doesn't mean practical is always the right thing," her mother said. She said it with the matter-of-factness of someone making an observation rather than a statement. "I know," Susane said. "I'm not saying it is or it isn't," her mother said. "I'm saying you'll know which one it needs to be." After they hung up, she sat with the Sunday afternoon for a while. She thought about her father, who had died when she was 9, and whom she remembered in specific and non-comprehensive images, a laugh, a morning routine, the particular smell of the coat he wore for the cold months. She thought about her mother's 20 years at the hospital and what practicality had cost, and what it had given. She thought about the version of her life that would have stayed in Greenfield, and what it would have looked like, and she was not sorry she was not in it, but she understood it. She thought about what she'd said about Carmine's, "The first time I saw you, I thought you were terrible." She thought about what Julian had said in the October dinner about the trip to Japan, that he'd spent 2 weeks moving through a country on its own logic rather than his own. She thought about what it meant to let a thing have its own logic. She was learning that still. Letting things be what they were, instead of what she'd decided they would be. It was harder than she'd expected and more consistently necessary than she'd thought. She opened her laptop. She had a competitive analysis to finish before Monday. Karen sent her the formal handoff for the mapping project on a Thursday in January, which was the kind of day in Boston that had given up on being reasonable and committed fully to winter. The analysis was substantial, a cross-sector competitive mapping covering 6 market segments, with a recommendation that would feed into BrownTech's Q2 strategic planning cycle. It was the largest solo project she'd been assigned. She started on it the same day. She put together the framework by Thursday afternoon and identified the key questions by Friday morning. By the following Tuesday, she had the first section done and sent it to Karen for early review. Karen replied, "Good start. The third segment needs more depth." She went back to the third segment. This was the work. Not the Stellar Path drama, not the Richard Stowe article, not the board meeting, or the Harwick text, or the soft kiss at 9 at night in a quiet office. Those were the events that the story would be told through. But the work was the daily reality. The third segment that needed more depth, the Tuesday meetings, the calibration between certainty and strong likelihood, the open files, the questions that generated other questions. She thought about what Julian had said when she'd asked him what he'd valued at this stage, being in the room where decisions actually get made. She was in the room. She'd been in the room for 8 months now. The room was demanding and sometimes frustrating and occasionally exhilarating, and it was always, without exception, real. There was no version of this work that was performed rather than actual. The decisions affected real things: companies, contracts, people's jobs, the company's direction, the $47 million, and all the other numbers behind it. She had contributed to those decisions. She was accountable for the contributions. That was the thing she'd wanted at 22, and that she had at 23, and that she understood now was not a destination, but a condition, something you kept maintaining rather than something you arrived at. She went back to the third segment. She found what it needed. She added it.
10.
Julian had a habit she noticed in February, in the way she noticed things now, less cataloging, more the ordinary attention of someone who knew a person. When he was in the middle of a problem he was genuinely uncertain about, he stopped using his pen. The pen turning that was his under-occupation gesture, the thing she'd noticed at Carmine's and understood wrongly, disappeared when he was actually working. He went still. He looked at something that wasn't in the room. She had asked him about it once, and he'd said, "I didn't know I did that." "You do," she said. He thought about it. "The pen is something to do with my hands when my mind is somewhere else," he said. "When my mind is actually working, I don't need it." "That makes sense," she said. "Do you have something like that?" She thought about it. "I straighten things," she said. "When I'm thinking, I'll align something on my desk or adjust the angle of my laptop screen. I don't notice I'm doing it until I've done it." He looked at her desk, which was slightly more organized than most people's. "How often are you thinking?" he said with the dry quality. "Usually," she said. He'd almost smiled. She'd looked away to give it room. She thought about the small private knowledge of someone to pen the desk, straightening the at-home version versus the work version versus the end-of-a-long-day version. The accumulation of specifics that turned a person into an actual person rather than a type. She'd had the type before at Carmine's and in the interview room before she'd revised. Now she had the person. The person was better. She went back to Carmine's once more in February on her own. Not for any particular reason. She was in Cambridge for a meeting that ended in the evening, and she walked past it and went in. She sat at the bar and ordered the coffee that was too late in the day for coffee and drank it anyway. The bar area had the same ambient quality as always: low light, small tables. The murmur of people in the privacy of a space that encouraged private things. She thought about the night. The glamorous woman, the wrong impression, the 40% tip. She thought about being wrong quickly and confidently and how long the revision had taken. She thought about all the things she'd learned about reading people, not that she was bad at it, which she wasn't, but that the speed of the read was a liability. That the closing instinct, the filing and moving on instinct was sometimes right and sometimes cost her the thing she most needed to see. She thought about the log, the not yet in week 7, the patience of accumulation. She thought about the fact that she was 23 years old and had a real job and a real relationship and a real understanding of how she made decisions, including the ways she made them wrong, and that these things did not feel like accomplishments so much as foundations, like the things you build the actual structure on. She finished her coffee. She left a generous tip not out of guilt or correction, just because it was a late evening and the bartender had been pleasant. She walked out into the February cold and headed toward the tea stop. She did not look back at the bar. She was looking forward.
Madi.
Spring came to Boston in the usual late and grudging way, as if the city needed to be convinced of it. March announced itself with cold rain. April sent mixed signals. And then one day in the third week of April, the light changed and the trees in the south end had leaves on them, and the harbor looked different, wider, somehow more generous, and it was actually spring. She walked to work that morning. The office was 2 miles from her apartment, and she'd started walking on the days that permitted it, which was more for the thinking time than for anything else. An hour of her own thoughts, the city around her, the particular quality of a morning that hadn't been used yet. She thought about the year. She thought about the things she'd learned and the things she was still learning and the things she probably wouldn't learn until they became necessary. She thought about the competitive mapping which was finished and had been received by Karen with the flat good that meant more than it said, and which had fed into the Q2 planning in the way it was supposed to. She thought about Julian's question from the first October dinner. What are you optimizing for? She'd said she was trying to figure out whether she made her best decisions in controlled environments or volatile ones. She had more data now. The answer was it depended less on the environment than on whether she was honest with herself about what she was seeing. In volatile environments, she'd made good decisions when she'd waited for enough information and bad ones when she'd closed around an early impression. In controlled environments, the same was true. The environment was not the variable. The honesty was the variable. She arrived at the Brown Tech building at 8:40. She took the elevator to the 11th floor and went to her desk and opened her files and started the day. At 9:15, Julian came in and sat at the head of the table for the Tuesday meeting. He ran it the way he always ran it. She contributed the way she always contributed. The meeting ended. She went back to her desk. She was learning its long and ordinary and necessary way that this was what a good life looked like from inside it. Not a fixed point of arrival, but a direction maintained. The work, and the person, and the growing, and the revising, the open files, and the decisions that were still being made. She opened the next project. She began.